My daughter's text crushed me. Dad, you are banned from our Italian vacation. Darian says family only. This happened hours after I had spent $95,000 on their house, so I canceled all the payments and put the house up for sale. But that was just the beginning. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. I am Edgar, 68 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my own flesh and blood inflicted. The harsh glare of my phone screen illuminated the dark mahogany of my glass-topped coffee table. A single text message from my daughter Kendra sat there flashing like a warning beacon in enemy territory. I picked up the device and read the words that were meant to break an old man's heart. Dad, you are banned from our Italian vacation. Darian says this trip is for family only. For a long moment, the quiet hum of the air conditioner was the only sound in my living room. A typical father might have broken down, wept, or immediately dialed his daughter's number demanding an explanation. I did none of those things. My reaction was not born of sorrow. It was the cold, detached calculation of a retired combat engineer assessing a sudden imminent threat. My military training had taught me that panic gets you killed, but a clear head dismantles the enemy's foundation. Darian. My white son-in-law had always viewed me with thinly veiled contempt, treating my disciplined life as an outdated relic. Now he had manipulated my only daughter into severing me from the family unit entirely. The words family only echoed in my mind, stripping away the illusion of harmony we had maintained for years. They wanted me erased. They believed an aging African-American veteran would simply bow his head, accept the disrespect, and quietly fade into the background. I placed the phone back on the glass table with deliberate slowness. The emotional bond I had nurtured for Kendra instantly shifted into a tactical perimeter. I was no longer a grieving father dealing with a rebellious child. I was an engineer staring at a structurally compromised bridge preparing to plant the demolition charges. My gaze shifted from the glowing screen to a crisp white piece of paper resting just inches away. It was a physical receipt from my bank printed merely 3 hours prior. The ink was barely dry on a confirmed wire transfer for exactly $95,000. That money was earmarked for a massive top-to-bottom renovation of the sprawling suburban house where Kendra and Darian currently lived. Darian had spent months complaining about the outdated kitchen, the lack of an open-concept living space, and the drafty master suite. Against my better judgment, I had authorized the release of my hard-earned retirement funds to give them their dream home. I had stood in the marble-floored lobby of the downtown bank that morning, signing away decades of savings built through sweat and combat pay. But there was a vital piece of context that Darian consistently chose to ignore in his arrogant assumptions. He treated the property as his personal kingdom, hosting lavish dinner parties and bragging to his friends about his prime real estate. The reality, meticulously documented in the county registrar's office, was entirely different. I held the absolute deed to that property. I had purchased the home outright 8 years ago, offering it to them as a temporary stepping stone. I paid the property taxes. I paid the insurance. Darian owned nothing but the designer suits in his closet. He believed my money was an endless river flowing directly into his pockets, and he assumed his position was untouchable. He was profoundly mistaken. Looking at the $95,000 receipt, the sheer audacity of his timing crystallized in my mind. He had waited until the very day the renovation funds cleared to have Kendra banish me. He wanted my wealth, but he did not want my presence. There was zero hesitation in my next sequence of actions. I did not shed a tear, and I did not let anger cloud my focus. I walked over to my desk, opened my laptop, and booted up my secure banking portal. The interface loaded with familiar efficiency. My fingers moved across the keyboard with the same steady precision I once used to disarm explosive ordnance in hostile territories. I navigated directly to the Pending Transactions tab, located the $95,000 wire transfer destined for Darian's chosen contractor, and initiated an emergency stop payment. The system prompted me for a security authorization code. I typed it in, pressed enter, and watched the status bar change from pending to canceled. The funds immediately reverted back into my absolute control. The lifeblood of Darian's luxurious renovation project was instantly severed. I closed the laptop and picked up my phone. I dialed the direct line of a high-end real estate broker I had known for over a decade. He answered on the second ring, recognizing my number immediately. I spoke with absolute clarity, completely devoid of any emotional wavering. I instructed him to list the property Kendra and Darian currently occupied. I did not ask for a market analysis or a prolonged staging period. I ordered him to put the house up for sale within the next 24 hours. I demanded a cash-only buyer and authorized a highly aggressive asking price to guarantee a swift transaction. The broker confirmed my directives, promising the listing would be live across all networks before sunrise. My son-in-law wanted a family-only lifestyle without me in the picture. I was simply accommodating his harsh request by removing my physical property from his daily equation. The financial umbilical cord was cut permanently. With the financial mechanisms securely in place, a sudden urgent thought struck me. Deep within that house, stored safely in the attic, was a specific wooden cedar chest containing the most precious heirloom belonging to my late wife, Naomi. It was a handcrafted music box she had cherished since childhood. I grabbed my heavy jacket, walked out to my truck, and drove straight to the suburban neighborhood. The evening air was cool, but a tight knot formed in my chest as I pulled into the familiar driveway. I stepped out of the vehicle, retrieving my brass key from my pocket. I walked up the concrete path, climbed the front steps, and inserted the key into the deadbolt of the heavy oak door. It refused to turn. I pulled the key out and inspected the lock. The cylinder was completely smooth, freshly installed, and gleaming under the porch light. Darian had changed the locks on my own property without saying a single word to me. A surge of icy realization washed over me. I stepped back from the door and turned around to scan the property. There, parked aggressively on the edge of my manicured lawn, sat a massive, rust-covered industrial dumpster. I walked toward the heavy steel container, the foul stench of discarded waste hitting my senses. I looked over the rusty edge and felt the breath completely leave my lungs. The dumpster was not filled with construction debris or old drywall. It was filled to the brim with Naomi's personal belongings. Her vintage dresses, her framed photographs, and her delicate porcelain collection were tossed carelessly among garbage bags and rotting food. Darian had thrown my dead wife's legacy into the trash to make room for his modern aesthetic. The battle lines were officially drawn. I hoisted my 68-year-old frame over the rusted edge of the industrial dumpster and dropped down into the refuse. The stench of rotting food and damp cardboard hit my lungs, but I forced my breathing into a slow, rhythmic pattern. My boots crushed against shards of broken ceramic. I looked down and recognized the hand-painted floral plates Naomi had bought on our honeymoon. They were shattered into jagged fragments scattered carelessly across stained trash bags. I dropped to my knees in the filth and began digging with bare hands. I pushed aside torn sweaters and discarded magazines until I felt the familiar leather binding of a photo album. I pulled it free from the mess. The cover was smeared with coffee grounds, but inside the photographs of our early years together were still intact. A profound icy fury settled deep into my bones. This was not a careless mistake during a chaotic renovation. This was a deliberate, calculated erasure. Darian had meticulously gathered every physical trace of my wife and tossed it into the garbage like worthless debris. He wanted to wipe out the history of the African-American man who bought this property and the woman who made it a home. Every framed memory, every delicate porcelain figure she had dusted with care was sitting in this metal bin. I did not yell or curse at the empty driveway. My military training took over completely. I cataloged the damage, secured the remaining intact albums inside my heavy jacket, and allowed the cold anger to sharpen my focus into a deadly precision. Darian thought he had successfully sanitized the property of my existence, but he had merely given me the absolute clarity required to dismantle his life. Naomi passed away exactly 10 years ago after a grueling battle with an illness that slowly drained the life from her vibrant spirit. I sat by her hospital bed on her final night, holding her frail hand as the medical monitors hummed their steady, unforgiving rhythm. Her last words to me were a simple, desperate plea to protect our daughter Kendra no matter what happened. I gave her my word as a husband and a soldier. That single promise became the core compass for my entire existence, but it also became a severe tactical vulnerability. When Kendra brought Darian home 5 years ago, my instincts immediately flagged his arrogant demeanor and smooth-talking charm as massive liabilities. He was a white man who wore clothes he could not afford and spoke of grand business ventures that lacked any structural foundation. Yet whenever Kendra looked at him, she smiled with a brightness I had not seen since her mother died. My vow to Naomi blinded me to the glaring warning signs. I chose to finance their lifestyle to keep the peace and maintain my daughter's happiness. I paid off his initial credit card debts, ignored his constant demands for upgraded vehicles, and allowed his financial parasitism to drain my accounts. I rationalized it as fulfilling my duty to protect Kendra from hardship. In reality, I was funding the enemy. I had compromised my own defensive perimeter to appease a man who viewed my generosity as weakness. Standing in this dumpster surrounded by the physical ruins of my marriage, the veil of obligation lifted entirely. The grace period I had extended to Darian out of love for my daughter was officially terminated. I continued sifting through the wreckage to ensure no other irreplaceable heirlooms remained buried in the debris. My bare hands scraped against something cold and rigid hidden beneath a thick pile of soggy newspapers and broken floor tiles. I pulled the refuse away and unearthed a small, dark gray metal lockbox. The heavy iron hinges were severely warped and the front locking mechanism had been violently smashed inward, likely with a heavy hammer or a crowbar. It was not a security box Naomi or I had ever owned. I wedged my fingers into the bent metal seam and applied steady upward pressure until the damaged lid popped open with a sharp metallic crack. There were no valuables or sentimental items inside. Instead, the box contained a thick stack of legal-sized papers bound tightly with thick rubber bands. The top sheets were heavily crumpled and stained, clearly discarded in a frantic, uncalculated rush. I pulled the stack out and brushed away the grime to read the bold black text printed at the top of the first page. It was a formal contract from a notorious high-interest predatory lending firm known for bypassing standard banking regulations and operating in the shadows. My eyes scanned the dense paragraphs of legal jargon identifying the extreme interest rates and the draconian penalty clauses designed to trap desperate borrowers in endless debt cycles. Darian had not just been squandering the generous allowances I provided him. He had bypassed legitimate financial institutions to secure capital from dangerous lenders who operated entirely outside the conventional system. I flipped through the pages tracking the flow of the transaction. The documents outlined a massive infusion of cash provided directly to Darian just 2 weeks ago. I carefully separated the remaining pages, treating the document with the same intense, unbroken scrutiny I would apply to an unexploded munition in the field. The second page detailed the specific collateral required to secure such a highly volatile financial agreement. My breathing slowed as I processed the printed address listed under the primary asset description. It was the exact address of the suburban house I was currently standing outside of. Darian had explicitly leveraged my personal property to secure a $300,000 cash loan from these predatory lenders. He had put the roof over his head, the very home I legally owned and paid taxes on the line to fund a massive undisclosed venture. But a loan of that staggering magnitude against a property he did not legally own required explicit authorization from the true deed holder. I flipped to the third page where the final agreement terms were laid out above the authorized signature blocks. My eyes locked onto the primary guarantor line located at the bottom right corner of the document. Staring back at me, written in bold blue ink, was my own name. The signature was an absolutely flawless forgery. Every unique loop and sharp angle of my handwriting had been replicated with a disturbing level of precision. Darian had not merely taken advantage of my familial generosity. He had committed a major federal crime. He had stolen my identity and placed a massive financial lien against my asset without my knowledge or consent. He clearly believed that banning me from the Italian vacation would keep me distracted long enough for him to abscond with the cash. He thought the old man would just stay home and remain quiet. Instead, he had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy his entire world. I deliberately arrived at the First National Bank exactly 2 minutes before the heavy glass doors unlocked for the morning rush. The moment the security guard turned the latch, I bypassed the teller line and walked directly into the branch manager's office. Mr. Vance sat behind his polished mahogany desk nursing a cup of coffee. I did not offer a polite greeting. I threw the crumpled, grease-stained loan documents directly onto his keyboard. The heavy thud of the paper made him jump in his leather chair. I pointed to the third page, keeping my voice dangerously level. I demanded to know how a $300,000 cash loan was issued against my property without my physical presence or verbal authorization. Vance picked up the papers, his eyes darting frantically across the text. A thick bead of sweat instantly formed on his pale forehead. He stammered, adjusting his tie as if the room had suddenly lost all its oxygen. He explained that Darian had walked into the branch 3 days ago holding a fully notarized power of attorney. According to Vance, the document explicitly granted my son-in-law comprehensive control over my real estate portfolio. Darian had spun a convincing lie claiming my advanced age and declining health prevented me from traveling downtown to handle the transaction personally. The sheer arrogance of a young white man walking into my bank and effortlessly overriding 40 years of my pristine financial history filled me with a cold, absolute resolve. I leaned over the mahogany desk, invading his personal space. I informed the manager that my signature had been masterfully forged and the notary stamp was undeniably fraudulent. I told him he had exactly 60 seconds to pull up my account details before I involved federal investigators. Vance began typing with frantic, clumsy fingers, his breath hitching in his chest. I did not give him room to recover from his catastrophic oversight. I ordered him to pull the security camera footage from the exact hour Darian sat in this office. I absolutely needed direct visual confirmation of the notary who had accompanied my son-in-law to facilitate this massive fraud. While the terrified manager scrambled to access the video archives, I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and dialed my attorney, Mitchell. Mitchell is a ruthless corporate litigator who has handled my asset management since I retired from the military. I put the call on speakerphone and placed the device flat on the manager's desk to ensure Vance heard every single word. I gave Mitchell a direct tactical command. I instructed him to instantly freeze every financial asset attached to my Social Security number, including all checking accounts, savings portfolios, and the joint credit lines I had previously opened to assist Kendra. I stated clearly that a severe identity theft breach had compromised my entire financial perimeter. Mitchell did not waste time asking unnecessary questions. He recognized the tone of voice I reserved exclusively for crisis management. He promised to lock down the accounts within 3 minutes, erecting an impenetrable financial wall around my wealth. I watched Vance wipe his brow with a trembling hand as he navigated the bank's internal system. I was systematically cutting the supply lines to Darian's operation. The pampered son-in-law thought he had outsmarted a weary old man, but he was completely unaware that he had just initiated a total war. Every credit card he possessed, every account he relied upon to fund his luxurious lifestyle was currently dying a sudden digital death. The clatter of the keyboard suddenly stopped. The silence in the spacious office became heavy and suffocating. I looked down at Vance. The remaining color had completely drained from his face, leaving his skin an ashen, sickly gray. He stared at his computer monitor as if he were looking at a live, explosive device. His mouth opened and closed twice before he could manage to formulate a coherent sentence. He swallowed hard and told me that the system was reflecting an active, real-time transaction on the compromised loan account. My eyes narrowed. I demanded he explain precisely what was happening with my stolen funds. Vance's hands shook violently as he reached for his computer mouse. He clicked a command to generate a physical receipt. The heavy laser printer in the corner of his office hummed to life, churning out a single sheet of paper. Vance grabbed the document and slid it across the polished mahogany surface toward me. He could not bring himself to look me in the eye. He whispered in a weak voice that he was deeply sorry, but the account freeze had been executed just a fraction of a second too late. Someone had successfully bypassed the standard security protocols using the forged power of attorney credentials. The sheer panic radiating from the manager confirmed that this was not a simple domestic theft. Darian was executing a highly sophisticated financial maneuver right under the nose of an established banking institution. I picked up the warm piece of paper, keeping my facial expression entirely blank. I scanned the intricate lines of transaction data tracking the exact flow of the stolen capital. What I read on that page completely shattered the narrative my daughter had blindly accepted. The printed ledger clearly detailed a massive expedited international wire transfer executed exactly 10 minutes ago. Darian had successfully moved $50,000 out of the fraudulent loan account. However, the destination of the funds exposed a terrifying new reality. The money was not sent to a luxury travel agency, an airline, or a high-end villa rental service. The $50,000 had been wired directly into an untraceable offshore corporate account based in Naples, Italy. The pieces of the puzzle aggressively slammed together in my mind. The sudden, desperate push for a European vacation was an absolute fabrication. Darian had manipulated Kendra into packing her bags for a romantic getaway to shield his true intentions. He had deliberately banned me from the trip not because he wanted a private family experience, but because an observant, seasoned veteran would immediately spot the logistical inconsistencies of his travel itinerary. The trip to Italy was a meticulously orchestrated cover story for a highly illegal international money laundering operation. My son-in-law was actively funneling stolen American real estate capital into foreign shadow accounts. The sheer magnitude of the crime indicated he was deeply entangled with extremely dangerous individuals. He was using my daughter as an unwitting human shield to cross international borders while executing a major financial felony. I folded the paper and placed it into my jacket pocket. The situation had escalated far beyond a simple case of elder abuse and forged documents. Darian was dragging Kendra into a lethal criminal underworld. I stepped away from the manager's desk, my mind shifting from defensive containment to aggressive extraction. I had to dismantle his entire operation before Kendra boarded that flight and became an accessory to an international crime. The heavy mahogany doors of Mitchell's downtown law firm closed with a solid thud, sealing us securely inside his soundproof conference room. I placed the forged loan documents flat on the polished table. Mitchell examined the fraudulent signature for less than 10 seconds before picking up his secure desk phone. We did not waste time expressing shock or dismay over Darian's criminal audacity. We operated with absolute, ruthless efficiency. I instructed Mitchell to execute a total financial blackout across my entire portfolio immediately. Within minutes, his legal team initiated the rapid transfer of all my legitimate assets, liquid capital, and real estate holdings into an impenetrable blind trust. I watched the digital confirmations populate on Mitchell's large wall monitor. Every single bank account tied to my social security number was drained and legally barricaded behind layers of corporate protections. Darian had attempted to drain my life savings through a predatory shadow loan, but he had critically underestimated my legal infrastructure. By moving my wealth into a blind trust, I effectively erased my financial footprint from the public record entirely. Darian could forge 1,000 power of attorney documents, but they would all hit a reinforced concrete wall. He could no longer access a single cent of my money. The trust required dual-factor biometric authentication and Mitchell's direct physical presence to authorize any external withdrawal. I systematically stripped Darian of his stolen leverage. The massive line of credit he thought he had secured against my property was now floating in a frozen digital void completely inaccessible. The financial guillotine had dropped. I sat back in the heavy leather chair, feeling the cool surface against my spine, knowing that the parasitic lifeline my son-in-law had relied on for the past 5 years was now permanently severed. I approached this escalating crisis not as a betrayed father navigating a messy domestic dispute, but as a retired combat engineer directing a tactical siege. During my decades of rigorous military service, I learned that the fastest way to neutralize a hostile force is to sever their supply lines without warning. Darian had declared war the moment he forged my signature and banished me from the family vacation, so I simply applied standard operational doctrine. My joint credit accounts were the logistical supply lines fueling his luxurious facade. I directed Mitchell to flag every credit card carrying my name as severely compromised by international fraud. The response from the global banking networks was instantaneous and brutal. Thousands of miles away inside the bustling international terminal of the airport in Rome, the trap snapped shut. The platinum cards Darian had happily handed to Kendra to fund their European getaway were electronically incinerated. I pictured the exact moment the terminal cashier shook her head and handed the useless plastic back. Every attempt to purchase a luxury item, secure a premium lounge pass, or even buy a bottle of water would trigger a hard decline message. Darian had built his entire arrogant persona on the foundation of my hard-earned combat pay, wearing expensive suits and booking lavish trips on my dime. By cutting off the financial oxygen, I stripped him of his false armor. I treated the situation with zero emotional attachment, viewing the cascading account closures simply as successful strikes against enemy infrastructure. I sat quietly in the law office, watching the final verification codes flash across the computer screen. The financial quarantine was absolute. The enemy was completely isolated on foreign soil with zero operational capital remaining. The sharp ringing of my cell phone shattered the focused silence of the law office. The caller identification displayed Kendra's name. I answered the call, pressing the phone to my ear with a perfectly steady hand. The chaotic background noise of the Italian airport flooded the speaker, overlaid by the sound of my daughter screaming hysterically. Kendra demanded to know why her cards were returning severe fraud alerts and completely locking her out of the banking application. She did not ask if I was all right or if a genuine bank error had occurred. Her voice was laced with pure panic and misplaced fury. She accused me of deliberately stealing their life savings to maliciously punish them for the vacation ban. Darian had clearly convinced her that the money in my accounts inherently belonged to them, twisting my years of generosity into a bizarre sense of entitlement. Kendra shouted that she was standing at the customs desk utterly humiliated, surrounded by security guards who were questioning her invalid payment methods. She blamed my actions for ruining her marriage and destroying the only vacation she had looked forward to all year. The painful irony of her accusations washed over me. She was vehemently defending the very man who had just forged my signature to leverage her childhood home to an underground crime syndicate. Darian had manipulated her perception of reality so thoroughly that she viewed her own father as a malicious thief. I listened to her frantic sobbing without raising my voice or attempting to defend myself against her wild allegations. I let her exhaust her anger, knowing that every word she spoke was actually Darian's manipulative script echoing through her. I maintained my tactical silence, waiting patiently for the inevitable breaking point. The hysterical shouting abruptly stopped, replaced by a heavy, ragged breathing pattern. When Kendra finally spoke again, her voice had dropped into a terrified, trembling whisper. She told me she was hiding inside an airport restroom stall because Darian had just made a furious international phone call to the local authorities back in our city. The blood in my veins turned to ice as she relayed the immediate escalating threat. Kendra confessed that Darian was not simply angry about the declined credit cards. He had actively retaliated by launching a massive preemptive legal strike against me. She warned me that 2 armed police officers were currently standing directly outside my apartment building in America. Darian had explicitly instructed the officers to kick down my front door and execute an immediate arrest warrant. He had officially filed a catastrophic police report claiming I had broken into their suburban house, violently vandalized the property, and stolen nearly $100,000 in cash alongside priceless family assets. My son-in-law had weaponized the justice system to quickly neutralize me before I could expose his massive mortgage fraud. He intended to have me thrown into a holding cell, effectively silencing me while he finished draining whatever assets he could still physically reach. Kendra sobbed quietly into the receiver, begging me to run as fast as I could before the police breached my apartment. I hung up the phone and looked directly at Mitchell across the solid mahogany conference table. The situation had just escalated from a secure financial lockdown to a critical legal emergency. I grabbed my jacket and sprinted out of the law office, knowing the police were already gathering at my threshold. I pulled my heavy truck into the parking garage of my apartment complex, the tires screeching against the painted concrete. I killed the engine and took a single measured breath, grounding myself in the tactical reality of the moment. Panic was a luxury I could not afford. I walked briskly to the elevator, rode it to the 4th floor, and stepped out into the brightly lit corridor. The scene waiting for me was exactly as Kendra had frantically described. 2 uniformed city police officers stood squarely in front of my apartment door, their hands resting cautiously near their utility belts. Tucked safely behind their broad shoulders stood Darian. The moment his eyes locked onto mine, a smug, victorious grin stretched across his perfectly groomed face. He looked entirely out of place in my modest hallway, wearing a tailored navy suit paid for by my sweat, yet he carried himself like a conquering king. As I approached with slow, deliberate steps, Darian immediately launched into his rehearsed theatrical performance. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my chest, pitching his voice an octave higher to feign genuine distress. He loudly informed the officers that I was the dangerous vandal he had called them about. He falsely and vehemently accused me of breaking into his pristine suburban home just hours earlier, causing massive structural damage to the property and stealing tens of thousands of dollars worth of priceless family heirlooms. He claimed I was a bitter, estranged father, acting out of pure malice after being uninvited from a family vacation. Darian had meticulously framed the narrative to paint himself as the innocent victim of a deranged, violent old man. The officers immediately shifted their stances, stepping forward to block my path while placing their hands firmly on their holstered weapons. I did not raise my hands in surrender, nor did I raise my voice to hurl desperate denials at the armed men blocking my home. I remained a pillar of absolute stoicism, a hardened veteran perfectly accustomed to facing down hostile forces. I looked the lead officer directly in the eye and calmly stated my name, identifying myself as the legal resident of the apartment. With slow, highly visible movements, I retrieved my keys from my jacket pocket, stepped past Darian's arrogant smirk, and unlocked my front door. I pushed the heavy wood open and politely invited the 2 officers to step inside to resolve the matter professionally. Darian followed closely on their heels, practically vibrating with eager anticipation of my impending arrest. I walked straight past my modest living room furniture and approached the digital wall safe concealed behind a framed landscape photograph in my study. The officers watched my every move with intense scrutiny, their hands hovering near their radios. I punched in the complex alphanumeric sequence, grabbed the heavy steel handle, and pulled the reinforced door open. I did not retrieve a weapon or stolen cash. I reached inside and pulled out two specific, highly significant legal folders. I turned back to the officers and handed the first document directly to the lead patrolman. It was the original, fully notarized deed to the suburban property Darian claimed as his own, proving unequivocally that I was the sole legal owner of the house he accused me of burglarizing. I then handed over a second stack of paper. These were the original installation invoices and network registration codes for a comprehensive covert security camera system I had professionally hardwired into the exterior of that same property 5 years ago. I did not wait for the officers to fully process the complex legal jargon printed on the thick property deed. I grabbed the remote control from my coffee table and powered on the large television mounted on the living room wall. I seamlessly mirrored my secure mobile phone screen to the display, accessing the encrypted cloud storage linked to my covert suburban security network. I selected the exterior driveway camera and pressed play. The high-definition video filled the screen, broadcasting the undeniable truth in sharp, unblinking color. The footage clearly showed Darian completely alone, dragging the heavy industrial dumpster onto my front lawn. The officers watched in absolute silence as the digital version of my son-in-law carelessly hurled heavy cardboard boxes into the trash. The video captured him explicitly shattering Naomi's delicate porcelain plates and dumping her vintage clothing into the grime. There were no stolen heirlooms and no violent break-ins. The only vandalism occurring on that property was perpetrated by the man wearing the tailored Navy suit who had just dialed 911. The lead officer's expression shifted instantly from professional suspicion, directed at me, to profound, hardening anger, directed at the liar standing in my living room. Filing a false police report to orchestrate an illegal arrest is a severe criminal offense, and the officers realized they had been manipulated into acting as Darian's personal attack dogs. The second patrolman immediately unclipped his radio, stepping squarely between me and my son-in-law. With a sharp, authoritative command, the lead officer ordered Darian to step back against the wall and place his hands where they could be clearly seen. The smug, victorious grin was wiped completely off Darian's face, replaced by the sudden, terrifying realization that his brilliant tactical strike had just spectacularly backfired. The logical response for a man caught completely red-handed in a criminal lie would be immediate surrender or panicked retreat. Darian chose neither. He did not step back against the wall as commanded, nor did he raise his hands in compliance with the armed officers. Instead, his posture stiffened into a rigid stance of desperate defiance. He reached swiftly inside the breast pocket of his expensive designer jacket. The officers instantly dropped their hands to their holsters, barking loud warnings, but Darian ignored their tactical commands. He yanked his hand free, not holding a weapon, but clutching a thick, neatly folded sheaf of papers. He aggressively thrust the documents toward the lead patrolman, forcing the officer to take them. A glaring crimson-red stamp dominated the top margin of the first page. Darian's voice dropped the theatrical panic and shifted into a cold, terrifyingly authoritative tone. He looked the officers dead in the eye and boldly declared that the security footage they just watched was completely irrelevant. He stated that I was a deeply unwell man suffering from a rapid, violent onset of advanced dementia and extreme paranoia. He claimed my sudden delusion of ownership over his house and my obsessive hoarding of worthless junk were tragic symptoms of my rotting mind. The officers glanced down at the papers, their expressions twisting into deep, bureaucratic confusion. Darian did not allow them a moment to question his narrative. He stood tall in the center of my living room and loudly announced that the papers in their hands constituted a legally binding, court-certified medical mandate. He had procured a signed judicial order for my immediate mandatory psychiatric hold, granting him the absolute authority to drag me out of my own home and lock me inside a locked medical ward. I took the heavy cream-colored document from the lead officer's hands and scanned the densely typed paragraphs with cold, unwavering precision. The letterhead belonged to a highly exclusive private neurology clinic located in the city's wealthiest district. A licensed neurologist had officially signed a sworn affidavit declaring my rapid, irreversible mental decline. The doctor explicitly cited the sudden listing of the suburban property and the absolute freezing of my financial assets as undeniable clinical proof of manic paranoia and violent delusion. Darian had brilliantly weaponized my tactical defensive maneuvers, presenting them to the medical board not as the rational actions of a man protecting his stolen property, but as the chaotic flailing of a diseased mind losing its grip on reality. The medical jargon painted a horrifying picture of an elderly veteran who posed a severe immediate threat to himself and his loving family. According to the document, Darian had been granted temporary emergency medical guardianship to prevent me from completely destroying my estate. The final paragraph contained a stark, terrifying mandate stamped in bright red ink. The police were legally obligated to stand down, and my son-in-law was granted a strict 48-hour window to execute a forced institutionalization. He had the absolute authority to remove me from my residence and commit me to a locked psychiatric facility against my will. The officers looked at me with deep, bureaucratic sympathy, their hands slowly falling away from their heavy weapon holsters. They were bound entirely by the strict legal parameters of the signed medical warrant. I handed the document back to the lead officer with a perfectly steady hand, acknowledging the brutal trap Darian had sprung. He believed he had cornered me in my own living room, but he had merely dictated the timeline of his own destruction. I did not waste precious minutes arguing against a piece of paper validated by the state judicial system. I calmly informed the officers that I would comply fully with the assessment process requested. They escort Darian out of my personal space and immediately packed a heavy canvas duffel bag the second the heavy door clicked shut. I slipped out through the subterranean service exit of the apartment building to avoid any surveillance Darian might have established in the main lobby. I drove my truck through the rain-slicked streets and pulled into the dimly lit parking lot of a 24-hour diner situated on the industrial edge of the city. Waiting for me in a secluded corner booth was Hector. We had served together in 3 separate combat deployments, surviving situations far more lethal than a greedy son-in-law armed with forged medical papers. Hector had transitioned from military intelligence into a highly lucrative career as a shadow private investigator, specializing in aggressive digital forensics. I slid into the cracked vinyl booth across from him and laid out the entire tactical situation without missing a single critical beat. I handed him a high-resolution digital photograph I had discreetly taken of the neurologist's letterhead before leaving my apartment. Hector did not offer empty sympathy or shocked disbelief. He simply nodded, pulled his heavily modified laptop from his worn leather satchel, and connected to his secure, encrypted mobile network. We immediately began hunting the corrupt doctor's digital footprint, tracing the hidden connections between a prestigious medical professional and an unemployed son-in-law neck-deep in offshore money laundering. The diner smelled of stale coffee and fried grease as Hector's fingers flew across the keyboard, launching a barrage of targeted infiltration protocols against the private clinic's seemingly impenetrable administrative servers. The digital fortifications surrounding the elite neurology clinic were originally designed to repel standard corporate intrusions, but they crumpled instantly under Hector's relentless military-grade algorithmic assault. Within 20 short minutes, he had completely bypassed the primary firewall and tunneled directly into the facility's hidden financial ledgers. We were not looking for patient confidentiality records or benign medical histories. We were aggressively hunting for the specific monetary incentive that would convince a licensed specialist to perjure themselves and issue a fraudulent psychiatric mandate against a man they had never physically examined. Hector split his laptop screen, cross-referencing the clinic's incoming wire transfers with the timeline of Darian's recent shadow banking activity. The evidence materialized with sickening clarity. Hector uncovered a highly sophisticated chain of financial kickbacks routed through a series of anonymous international shell companies. Exactly 4 hours after Darian had secured the massive predatory loan against my suburban house, a perfectly synchronized payment of $30,000 was deposited directly into the neurologist's offshore consulting account. Darian had effectively purchased a counterfeit medical diagnosis using the very money he had stolen from the equity of my property. He had bribed a corrupt physician to declare me legally incompetent, thereby removing the only living obstacle standing between him and the complete liquidation of my life savings. The transaction logs laid bare the absolute ruthlessness of his strategy. He was not acting out of panic or simple, predictable greed. He was executing a calculated, highly financed conspiracy to strip me of my wealth, my freedom, and my basic human rights. I watched the glowing green numbers cascade across Hector's illuminated screen, internalizing the chilling reality of Darian's dark ambition. He had placed a precise dollar amount on my sanity, and the corrupt medical establishment had eagerly accepted his bloody currency. Hector continued to dig deeper into the clinic's restricted administrative directories, his eyes narrowing sharply as he intercepted a highly classified internal communication thread linked directly to my fabricated patient profile. He tapped the glowing screen sharply, drawing my full attention to a secondary document attached to the fraudulent psychiatric order. It was not a standard hospital admission form or a generic clinical referral. It was a fully executed, privately funded medical transport manifest. Darian did not just plan to take temporary control of my finances while I was held for evaluation at a local medical facility. The digital manifest revealed a far more permanent and terrifying logistical operation. Darian had explicitly contracted a private, heavily armed psychiatric transport team to forcefully extract me from my apartment building. The destination listed on the brutal itinerary was not a local city hospital, but a completely off-the-grid, highly secure institutional facility located deep across state lines. The manifest outlined a one-way trip to a shadow facility notorious for warehousing wealthy, problematic relatives whose guardians wanted them permanently silenced and chemically subdued. I looked closely at the bold red timestamp blazing across the top right corner of the secure extraction order. Darian was not going to wait for the standard 48-hour legal window to expire. The private medical transport was officially scheduled to breach my apartment and forcefully sedate me by midnight tonight. I had less than 2 hours before a highly trained team of armed mercenaries disguised as medical professionals kicked down my door. Darian intended to make me vanish across state lines before sunrise, leaving him completely unchecked to finalize his massive money laundering operation. I pushed myself up from the cracked vinyl booth, the cold reality of my impending abduction solidifying my absolute resolve. We were entirely out of time. The digital clock on the diner wall glared with a stark, unforgiving red light marking the rapid, steady evaporation of my freedom. I had less than 2 hours before a team of armed mercenaries descended upon my apartment to erase me from society. Retreating into hiding was not an option a combat engineer would entertain. Defensive maneuvers would only delay the inevitable extraction. I had to strike directly at the physical heart of Darian's fraudulent empire before the sun completely set today. The suburban house was the absolute center of gravity for his international money laundering operation, and I legally held the deed. I pulled my phone from my pocket and issued a rapid sequence of commands to Mitchell. I bypassed the standard, incredibly slow municipal sheriff eviction process. Instead, I authorized Mitchell to immediately retain the services of a highly elite private security contracting firm. I requested 2 fully bonded, heavily armed extraction specialists equipped with an expedited, court-certified 24-hour eviction mandate. I left Hector in the diner to continue dismantling the neurologist's digital infrastructure and drove my truck straight into the gathering twilight. I pulled into the familiar driveway of my property precisely as a matte black tactical vehicle parked along the curb. 2 imposing men wearing reinforced Kevlar vests and blank professional expressions stepped out onto the asphalt. They did not ask questions about family dynamics or domestic disputes. They simply verified my identity, examined the embossed judicial seal on the eviction mandate, and nodded their absolute readiness. I was no longer playing defense against a rogue son-in-law. I was reclaiming my territory by sheer, unyielding force. We moved in a tight, disciplined formation up the concrete walkway, preparing to breach the front threshold and permanently expel the hostile enemy from my land tonight. I did not bother knocking or politely announcing my arrival to the occupants. I planted my heavy combat boot squarely next to the locking mechanism and kicked the heavy oak door inward with a violent, splintering crash. The door slammed against the interior drywall, echoing through the cavernous foyer like a gunshot. The 2 security contractors instantly flanked me, sweeping the perimeter with tactical flashlights and securing the immediate entryway. I stepped into the house, expecting to confront Darian in his tailored suit, ready to dismantle his arrogant smirk with cold, hard legal authority. Instead, a terrifying, suffocating dead silence greeted my aggressive breach. The property was entirely plunged into darkness, the heavy curtains drawn tight against the fading evening light. Darian was absolutely nowhere to be found inside. Standing completely still in the center of the unlit living room was my daughter. Kendra looked like a fragile ghost haunting her own home. She had not boarded the planned international flight to Rome. She had returned from the airport entirely alone. The vibrant, confident young woman I had raised was completely gone, replaced by a hollow, trembling shell of a human being. Her face was gaunt, her cheekbones jutting out sharply beneath pale, sickly skin. She looked severely emaciated, her physical deterioration aggressively accelerated in just a matter of weeks. She was shivering violently despite the stifling warmth of the stagnant indoor air burying her shrinking frame deep inside a thick, oversized wool winter coat. She stared at me with wide, hollow eyes blinking rapidly against the harsh beams of the tactical flashlights crossing the floorboards. The aggressive fury propelling me through the breached doorway instantly evaporated, replaced by a cold, heavy dread. The enemy had abandoned the fortress, leaving behind a casualty of war I now barely recognized. I signaled for the security contractors to lower their tactical lights and hold their defensive positions by the shattered front entrance. I crossed the dark living room with slow, deliberate steps, treating the space like an active minefield. I pulled the court-certified eviction mandate from the inner pocket of my jacket. I did not want to hand this harsh legal reality to my daughter, but the tactical momentum required absolute follow-through to sever Darian's control. I stopped 2 feet away from her trembling figure and extended the folded white document. I kept my voice incredibly soft, stripping away the harsh authority of a commanding officer, and spoke to her simply as a father trying to guide his child out of a burning building. I told her that she needed to take the paper pack, a single bag of essentials, and leave this contaminated property with me immediately. Kendra stared at the eviction notice as if it were a venomous snake. She hesitated for a long, agonizing moment before her right hand slowly emerged from the heavy folds of the wool fabric. As she extended her trembling arm to accept the document, the oversized collar of the heavy winter coat shifted and slipped heavily down her left shoulder. The dim ambient light from the hallway spilled across her exposed skin, revealing a horrifying visual truth. I froze entirely, my breath catching painfully in my throat. Covering the entire expanse of her upper arm and tracking viciously across her fragile, delicate collarbone was a clustered series of deep, dark, agonizing bruises. The violent purple and yellow contusions were in various stages of healing, painting a gruesome timeline of sustained, methodical physical abuse. The illusion of her happy suburban marriage shattered instantly into a million broken, irreparable pieces. Kendra felt the heavy wool coat slip and desperately yanked the fabric back over her battered shoulder, but the devastating truth was already etched permanently into my vision. The heavy legal document slipped from her trembling fingers and fluttered silently to the hardwood floor. Her fragile legs completely gave out beneath her. She collapsed heavily to her bare knees in the center of the dark room, burying her face in her hands. A raw, agonizing sob tore through her emaciated frame, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror that no father should ever have to hear. She grabbed the bottom hem of my jacket, pleading with a frantic, breathless desperation. She desperately begged me to halt the eviction process immediately and cancel the pending real estate listing. She frantically warned me that if I reclaimed the property, Darian would not just walk away empty-handed. She looked up at me, her hollow eyes overflowing with absolute dread, and delivered a confession that fundamentally altered the entire battlefield. She revealed that Darian had explicitly threatened to murder her if he lost control of the house and the attached equity. The cruel text message banning me from the Italian vacation was not an act of rebellious disrespect. It was a desperate manufactured lie forced from her cellular phone under the immediate threat of extreme physical violence. She had never once been a willing participant in his offshore money laundering scheme or the fraudulent mortgage application. Darian had systematically and brutally isolated her, starved her, and physically broken her spirit to secure her absolute compliance. She was not a greedy co-conspirator plotting against my life savings. My only daughter was a completely desperate, terrified hostage trapped inside her own home, serving as human collateral for a ruthless international criminal. A blinding wave of primal paternal rage slammed into my chest the moment I saw those grotesque bruises marring my daughter's delicate skin. Every protective instinct I possessed screamed at me to tear the house apart and hunt Darian down, but my ingrained military discipline immediately overrode the sudden surge of pure emotion. Blind fury is a massive tactical liability in a hostage situation. I forced my breathing to stabilize, pushing the anger down into a cold, locked compartment in my mind, and focused entirely on the fragile woman sobbing on the hardwood floor. Kendra gripped my hands with terrifying desperation, the tears streaming freely down her sunken cheeks as she finally shattered the illusion of her perfect marriage. She choked out the horrifying truth about the text message that had initiated this entire waking nightmare. She had never wanted to ban me from the fictional Italian vacation. Darian had physically pinned her against the kitchen counter, twisting her arm until she cried out in agony solely to force her biometric fingerprint onto the sensor of her locked cellular phone. Once he breached her device, he personally typed and sent that cruel, dismissive message demanding a family-only trip. His strategy was chillingly clear and highly systematic. Darian needed to sever my emotional tether to Kendra to isolate me completely from their daily lives. By making me believe my own daughter had maliciously rejected me, he calculated I would retreat in bitter silence, leaving my finances utterly exposed and completely unguarded. He had meticulously weaponized her digital identity to build a protective wall around his international money laundering operation, assuming an aging, disconnected veteran would simply accept the total heartbreak and quietly walk away without ever questioning the terrible, deeply flawed logistics of his absolute ultimate betrayal against us here tonight. I gripped Kendra firmly by her uninjured shoulder, pulling her up from the floor and looking directly into her tear-filled eyes. I did not offer empty platitudes or gentle words of comfort because false reassurances are completely useless when navigating an active threat zone. I issued a direct, uncompromising tactical command instructing her to march straight upstairs and pack a single duffel bag in exactly 10 minutes. I ordered her to grab only essential identification documents, vital prescription medications, and durable clothing, leaving every single luxury item behind. I informed her that we were executing a permanent extraction from this contaminated environment. I intended to transport her immediately to an undisclosed federal safe house managed by Hector's most trusted associates, a secure location where Darian could never physically reach her again. Kendra nodded numbly, the sheer force of my absolute authority cutting through her paralyzing panic. She turned and practically sprinted up the wooden staircase, her heavy coat swishing against the banister as she raced to comply with my strict deadline. With my daughter temporarily secured on the second floor, I immediately shifted my entire focus to the exterior defense of the property. I walked over to the large bay window in the darkened living room and positioned myself out of the direct line of sight. I peeled back a tiny sliver of the heavy curtain to establish a clear vantage point of the street below. My two private security contractors were maintaining their assigned posts, perfectly standing watch by their armored vehicle parked at the edge of the driveway. The night air was thick and oppressively quiet, the kind of heavy suburban silence that usually precedes a sudden, violent ambush. I watched the perimeter, intensely scanning the dark street outside for any active signs of approaching hostile vehicles immediately. The suffocating suburban silence was brutally shattered by the violent, high-pitched screech of heavy rubber tearing across the asphalt pavement. A sleek, black luxury sedan swerved aggressively around the street corner and slammed into the curb directly across from my property, parking at a severely crooked angle. The headlights cut out as the engine died, casting long, erratic shadows across the manicured lawn. Darian had returned from his failed extraction mission much earlier than I had initially calculated, likely panicked by the total collapse of his financial networks. He did not arrive at the house alone. The driver and passenger doors swung open simultaneously, and two massive, heavily tattooed men stepped out onto the damp street alongside my son-in-law. They did not wear designer suits or carry the polished briefcases of legitimate banking associates. They moved with the unmistakable, heavy-footed swagger of hardened street enforcers. Both men possessed thick, muscular builds, their exposed skin covered in intricate, sprawling ink that signaled deep, violent allegiances to organized criminal syndicates. Each man effortlessly hauled a massive, bulging black duffel bag over his broad shoulder, the heavy canvas sagging under the sheer weight of what I immediately recognized as bulk physical currency. Darian had clearly bypassed the frozen digital banking portals and physically retrieved the illicit gambling cash directly from his underworld handlers. He was operating in a state of absolute frantic desperation, rushing to secure the unlaundered money inside the walls of the house before the federal authorities could intercept his movements. I watched from the darkened window as the three men clustered tightly together on the concrete sidewalk, their highly aggressive body language radiating raw, unpredictable hostility. The calculated money laundering scheme had completely dissolved into a highly volatile, highly explosive physical confrontation occurring right on my manicured front lawn tonight. Darian marched aggressively up the front walkway, barking urgent commands to the two heavily burdened enforcers trailing closely behind him. His frenzied march halted abruptly when he spotted the unfamiliar armored security vehicle idling silently near the edge of the property line. He recognized the two towering private contractors standing squarely in his path, blocking his direct access to the front entrance. Panic and sheer adrenaline visibly hijacked Darian's nervous system, instantly stripping away the last remaining shreds of his fabricated corporate persona. He reached blindly toward his lower back and yanked a sleek black semi-automatic handgun from the waistband of his designer trousers. He did not issue a verbal warning or attempt to negotiate his entry with the hired guards. Operating on pure, unrestrained terror, Darian leveled the weapon directly at the armored vehicle and pulled the trigger. The deafening crack of unexpected gunfire ruptured the quiet suburban neighborhood air. The high-velocity round slammed violently into the front driver's side tire of the security truck, blowing the thick rubber apart with a concussive blast and instantly disabling the primary extraction transport. The two security contractors dove aggressively behind the heavy steel engine block for cover, drawing their own tactical weapons, as the three criminals scattered toward the darkened exterior of the house. I immediately dropped away from the shattered living room window, moving with absolute military urgency. I sprinted toward the wooden staircase, racing to intercept Kendra before the gunfire caused her to panic. I grabbed her arm as she stumbled out of the master suite, dragging her backward into the narrow, unlit hallway. The heavy thud of combat boots slamming against the lower floorboards confirmed my absolute worst tactical fear. The hostile breach was completely successful, and we were now entirely trapped on the second floor of the house. The heavy thud of combat boots hammered against the wooden treads of the staircase, vibrating through the floorboards beneath my feet. I pulled Kendra into the master bedroom and slammed the heavy oak door shut, throwing the deadbolt just as a massive physical force crashed against the opposite side. Darian had dropped the calculated facade entirely. He kicked the solid wood paneling with frenzied animalistic rage, screaming my name with a terrifyingly sharp pitch. He demanded that I immediately unlock the door and sign the legal release forms for the blind trust I had established just hours prior. He had somehow tracked the financial lockdown and understood that my biometric signature was the only mechanism capable of releasing the millions currently suspended in the digital void. He battered the door again, the heavy hinges groaning under the immense pressure applied by the two street enforcers backing him up. Darian pressed his face against the narrow gap near the door jamb, his voice dropping to a lethal, raspy whisper. He declared that he possessed a fully loaded semi-automatic weapon and an absolute lack of restraint. He explicitly threatened to start firing high-velocity hollow-point rounds directly through the thin drywall of the bedroom unless I surrendered the banking credentials within the next 60 seconds. He promised to aim low to ensure maximum suffering, casually stating he only needed my right hand intact to physically authorize the biometric security locks. Kendra pressed her hands over her ears, sliding down the wall in sheer terror as the doorknob rattled violently. I did not waste time trying to negotiate with a cornered, heavily armed predator. I needed to create an immediate tactical diversion to secure a physical extraction route for my daughter before Darian made good on his ballistic threat. I scanned the master suite for any environmental advantage and locked my eyes on the polished chrome fire suppression sprinkler head mounted directly above the bedroom entryway. I grabbed the heavy brass base of a vintage desk lamp from the bedside table, gripping the metal firmly in my right hand. I instructed Kendra to stay absolutely flat against the floorboards and stepped directly into the fatal funnel of the doorway. Taking a single measured breath, I swung the brass lamp upward with maximum kinetic force, smashing the heavy base directly into the fragile red glass bulb of the sprinkler head. The pressurized system ruptured instantly with a deafening metallic snap. A violent torrent of freezing high-pressure industrial water exploded from the ceiling, blasting downward with the force of a fire hose. The sudden deluge soaked the drywall, flooded the carpeted floorboards, and aggressively poured through the gaps in the doorway directly onto the armed men outside. The cascading water instantly breached the primary electrical junction box located in the adjacent corridor. A massive surge of blue sparks erupted through the walls, followed by a loud, concussive popping sound. The internal breakers tripped entirely, severing the main power grid and plunging the entire second floor into absolute impenetrable darkness. Darian shrieked in sudden panic as the freezing water and electrical explosions completely shattered his tactical momentum. The element of surprise had forcefully shifted back into my hands. The enforcers slipped and cursed in the pitch-black flooded hallway, temporarily blinded and entirely disoriented by the sudden sensory overload. I dropped the brass lamp and moved silently through the dark, rushing back to Kendra to execute the final phase of our immediate vertical extraction from the besieged property. I navigated the pitch-black bedroom using pure muscle memory and pulled Kendra toward the attached master bathroom. I stripped the heavy, high-thread count bedsheets from the mattress, swiftly twisting the strong fabric into a thick, improvised extraction rope. I secured a reinforced climbing knot around the base of the massive cast-iron radiator anchored beneath the bathroom window, testing the structural integrity with my full body weight. I shoved the glass pane upward, letting the cold night air rush into the flooded dark room. I wrapped the makeshift harness securely around Kendra's waist, locking the fabric tightly to prevent any slippage. I commanded her to trust the line guiding her fragile frame over the window ledge and slowly lowering her down the exterior brick facade toward the dark side alley below. The wood of the bedroom door splintered violently behind me, the hinges finally giving way under the sustained assault of the enforcers. Just as Kendra's feet touched the wet grass, an untraceable matte black sedan slid silently into the narrow alleyway directly beneath the window. The rear passenger door swung open to reveal Hector, his weapon drawn and scanning the perimeter to cover our blind spot. I dropped the remaining length of the bedsheet and swung my legs over the windowsill as the locked bathroom door exploded inward. Darian charged into the dark bathroom, slipping wildly on the flooded tiles, screaming my name with unhinged fury. I did not look back. I leapt away from the brick facade, dropping the final 10 feet and rolling across the damp grass to absorb the kinetic impact. I scrambled directly into the back seat of Hector's idling vehicle, pulling the heavy door shut just as the engine roared with massive, unrestrained horsepower. Hector slammed the accelerator to the floorboard, tearing out of the suburban alleyway and merging aggressively onto the deserted main highway. We sped away into the dark, putting essential tactical distance between us and the compromised safe zone. The heater blared inside the cabin, warming the freezing, adrenaline-soaked silence. Kendra sat trembling violently in the center seat, clutching her oversized coat tightly around her battered shoulders. She looked at me in the dim glow of the dashboard instrumentation and finally dropped the most devastating piece of the entire complex puzzle. She revealed the absolute truth behind the frozen offshore account located in Naples. Darian had never invested my money in legitimate international real estate ventures or standard corporate acquisitions. The recipient account belonged entirely to a highly lethal underground Italian gambling syndicate. Darian had developed a massive, catastrophic gambling addiction and had leveraged the syndicate's dark money to cover his catastrophic losses. He had lost millions of dollars that simply did not belong to him, accumulating a massive debt that the syndicate demanded to be repaid in full. He had forged the mortgage against my house as a desperate final attempt to liquidate my assets and satisfy his ruthless creditors. Kendra confirmed that Darian currently owed the syndicate his actual life. The two heavily tattooed men who had accompanied him to the house were not local hired thugs or random street muscle. They were high-ranking mob enforcers dispatched directly from Europe, tracking Darian all the way back to American soil to ensure the immediate collection of their stolen capital. If Darian failed to deliver my life savings by dawn, the enforcers were explicitly ordered to execute him. Darian was operating under a literal death sentence, turning my family into collateral damage. The powerful engine of Hector's untraceable black sedan roared as we merged aggressively onto the deserted interstate, putting vital distance between us and the compromised suburban property. Kendra sat shivering in the back seat, pulling the heavy coat tightly around her shoulders while staring blankly at the passing streetlights. The raw terror radiating from my daughter solidified my focus into a weaponized, unbreakable calm. I processed the tactical data she had just provided regarding the Neapolitan gambling syndicate and the heavily armed enforcers currently hunting Darian. Standard evasion doctrine dictates putting maximum geographical distance between the target and the hostile forces, but my decades of military intelligence training immediately vetoed that strategy. Running was an absolute tactical failure. The syndicate possessed infinite international resources, corrupt political connections, and zero geographical boundaries. They would relentlessly track the financial debt across state lines, and Darian would gladly sacrifice our lives to wipe his bloody ledger clean. Surviving this crisis required an immediate shift from defensive evasion to a highly aggressive, preemptive, offensive strike. I could not simply hide in a federal safe house and wait for the enemy to eventually breach the perimeter. I had to permanently sever the syndicate's leverage and completely obliterate Darien's remaining operational infrastructure in one calculated blow. I leaned forward and instructed Hector to cancel the route to the secure extraction point. We were not retreating into the shadows to become perpetual prey. The syndicate demanded a massive financial payout, and Darien desperately needed my property to save his miserable life. I decided to bring the war directly to their doorstep and force a confrontation on my terms. I pulled my secure mobile phone from my jacket pocket, preparing to deploy the most dangerous tactical bait of my entire life. I dialed Mitchell's encrypted private number, knowing the seasoned attorney would answer regardless of the late hour. I did not offer any preliminary explanations or domestic updates. I issued a sequence of extreme, highly specific legal commands that would fundamentally shock the local real estate market. The suburban house was the absolute center of gravity for Darien's international money laundering operation, and I still maintained undisputed verified ownership of the property deed. I instructed Mitchell to bypass all standard brokerage protocols and immediately activate an emergency hard copy listing across the most exclusive shadow-tier investment networks in the city. The asking price was to be slashed to exactly 50% of its current verified market valuation. The singular non-negotiable condition for this catastrophic financial discount was a direct physical cash transaction. The prospective buyer was absolutely required to bypass traditional escrow safety measures and close the entire massive deal within 12 hours of the listing going live. Mitchell hesitated for a fraction of a second, warning me that intentionally liquidating a premium asset at half its value was financial suicide and would trigger severe regulatory scrutiny. I demanded absolute compliance, clarifying that this maneuver was not a legitimate real estate transaction. It was a highly calibrated tactical trap designed specifically to force the enemy into a careless, fatal error. Darien was operating under a literal death sentence and needed that house to pacify his ruthless handlers. Offering the contested asset at a massive irrational loss guaranteed the syndicate would smell blood in the water. They would rush to secure the property before another predatory investor could snatch the undervalued prize, dragging them directly into the blinding light of a public legal office. The digital snare was deployed across the high-level financial networks precisely at the break of dawn. Mitchell utilized his most aggressive, morally flexible broker contacts to push the distressed property listing directly into the hands of private holding firms and shadow investors who specialized in moving vast sums of liquid capital without standard banking oversight. Hector and I established a secure operational command center in a rented commercial suite located directly across the street from Mitchell's downtown law firm. We monitored the incoming digital communications traffic alongside Kendra, who had finally managed to collapse into a few hours of exhausted, dreamless sleep on a leather sofa in the corner. The tension in the room was palpable, thick with the smell of strong black coffee and adrenaline. We did not have to wait long for the bait to trigger a strike. Less than 3 hours after the extreme fire sale listing went live on the underground servers, Mitchell's secure line registered a priority incoming call. An anonymous representative acting on behalf of a heavily shielded private holdings corporation aggressively bypassed all standard bidding procedures. The caller offered to meet the exact discounted asking price utilizing untraceable, non-sequential physical currency. The representative eagerly agreed to the absurdly aggressive 12-hour closing window, expressing zero concern regarding property inspections or structural appraisals. The anonymous buyer insisted on finalizing the massive transaction in person at Mitchell's private law office before the stroke of noon. The trap had been triggered with spectacular, desperate speed. The syndicate's overwhelming greed had successfully overridden their operational caution, drawing them completely away from the safety of the dark suburban streets and bringing them directly into a highly controlled, legally fortified environment. The heavy mahogany doors of Mitchell's primary conference room swung open precisely at 11:45. I stood silently in the adjacent observation suite, looking directly through the one-way mirrored glass originally designed for confidential witness identification. Hector stood squarely beside me, his hand resting casually but firmly near his concealed weapon. A towering, broad-shouldered man stepped confidently into the polished legal suite, carrying 2 massive reinforced steel briefcases that strained the muscles in his thick forearms. The visitor wore an expensive tailored charcoal suit clearly intended to project an aura of legitimate corporate wealth. However, the expensive Italian fabric could not fully conceal the sprawling, intricate black ink creeping aggressively up his muscular neck. I locked onto the man's cold, dead eyes and recognized his facial structure with absolute chilling certainty. He was the exact same mob enforcer who had stalked across my suburban lawn, carrying heavy duffel bags of illicit cash just hours earlier. The terrifying reality of the entire situation locked into place with mathematical precision, forcing me to rapidly reassess the battlefield. Darian was not simply orchestrating a panicked fire sale to pay off a violent gambling debt. He was actively utilizing my baited trap to execute a brilliant, massive criminal transaction. The enforcer was using the syndicate's underground dirty currency to officially purchase my heavily discounted property. Darian was effectively laundering millions of dollars of bloody mob cash into a pristine, legally binding, highly profitable American real estate asset right under the nose of the justice system. My son-in-law had seamlessly flipped my tactical snare, transforming a simple property handover into a massive, heavily funded money laundering operation designed to permanently enrich the very men sent to kill him. The air inside Mitchell's private conference room grew incredibly thick, suffocating the space with an almost physical weight as I took my seat directly across the mahogany table from the towering mob enforcer. He placed the two reinforced steel briefcases on the polished wood surface with a heavy metallic thud, his dark, dead eyes never leaving my face. The expensive charcoal suit he wore did nothing to mask the raw, predatory violence simmering just beneath his skin. He folded his large, heavily tattooed hands over the briefcases, projecting an aura of absolute dominance and lethal intent. I maintained my tactical composure, settling back into the heavy leather chair while projecting the image of a defeated, desperate old man simply looking to liquidate an asset. I let my shoulders sag slightly, perfectly concealing the hyper-vigilant military discipline locking every muscle in my body into a state of total readiness. What the enforcer did not know, and what Darian had completely failed to anticipate, was that this specific conference room had been meticulously prepped for a high-stakes intelligence extraction. Hours before the meeting, Hector had seamlessly integrated military-grade high-definition audio and visual recording devices directly beneath the lip of the mahogany table and behind the intricate crown molding framing the ceiling. Every single breath, every rustle of paper, and every spoken syllable was currently being broadcast and digitally preserved on a highly encrypted federal server. Mitchell sat quietly to my left, arranging the fraudulent sale documents with practiced legal precision, playing his role flawlessly. The enforcer leaned forward, the faint scent of stale cigarette smoke and cheap cologne washing over the table, entirely unaware that he had just willingly walked into a heavily fortified digital interrogation cell designed specifically to completely dismantle his entire underground syndicate. I required absolute, undeniable verbal confirmation of the criminal conspiracy to ensure the federal indictments would hold up in a court of law. I leaned forward and picked up the thick stack of real estate transfer documents, intentionally squinting at the complex legal jargon to artificially protract the signing process. I began reading the standard liability clauses aloud, deliberately misinterpreting the escrow timelines and questioning the lack of standard banking wire protocols. The enforcer's jaw tightened visibly, a heavy vein pulsing against the dark ink covering his neck as his minimal patience rapidly deteriorated. He drummed his thick fingers against the steel briefcases, demanding I stop stalling and just sign the bottom line so he could secure the physical deed. I pushed the papers back across the mahogany table, looking him directly in his cold eyes, and plainly stated I would not transfer a multi-million-dollar property to an anonymous buyer without knowing exactly where the physical cash originated. I boldly questioned his direct relationship with Darian, openly mocking my son-in-law as a pathetic, incompetent gambler who could never legitimately finance a transaction of this magnitude. The calculated insult instantly fractured the enforcer's professional facade. His massive hands slammed flat against the table, rattling the crystal water glasses. Driven by sheer aggressive ego and an overwhelming desire to assert his dominance over a supposedly weak old man, he leaned directly over the hidden microphones and loudly delivered his own damning confession. He explicitly sneered that Darian was a desperate, pathetic asset who owed his international syndicate millions in illicit gambling debts. He proudly declared that the cash inside the briefcases was unlaundered street money collected from illegal overseas operations, brought onto American soil specifically to convert Darian's massive debt into a clean, highly profitable real estate portfolio. The enforcer's aggressive, prideful outburst echoed perfectly through the silent conference room, delivering exactly the fatal strike I needed to permanently cripple their entire operation. Hector's hidden recording devices flawlessly captured every single syllable of the lethal confession in pristine, high-definition audio. The enforcer had just willingly provided federal investigators with absolute, irrefutable proof of international money laundering, systemic extortion, and coordinated organized crime activities directly linked to Darian's fraudulent real estate maneuver. The legal guillotine had been fully loaded and hoisted into position. Mitchell shot me a brief microscopic glance, silently confirming that the necessary auditory evidence was securely locked within the encrypted digital vault. The massive syndicate that had brutally terrorized my daughter and threatened to drain my life savings was now entirely compromised by their own arrogant enforcer. I allowed a faint, subservient sigh to escape my lips, playing the role of a terrified civilian finally bowing to overwhelming criminal intimidation. I pulled the heavy stack of property transfer documents back across the polished mahogany surface, aligning the thick paper squarely in front of my chest. I unclipped the silver fountain pen from my breast pocket, maintaining a slow, defeated posture to keep the enforcer's adrenaline completely neutralized. He leaned back into his heavy leather chair, crossing his massive arms with a deeply satisfied, arrogant smirk, entirely convinced he had successfully terrorized an old man into submission. He believed the syndicate had won, completely blind to the reality that my signature would instantly trigger a massive federal raid. I gripped the silver pen firmly, lowering the gold nib toward the designated signature line to finalize the lethal sting operation and permanently sever Darian's parasitic grip on my stolen wealth and my heavily battered family. The heavy silver pen hovered less than an inch above the crisp white paper when a violent, deafening crash completely shattered the suffocating tension inside the room. The thick mahogany double doors of the private conference room exploded inward, the heavy brass locking mechanism ripping violently from the wooden frame and clattering across the polished floorboards. Darian stormed aggressively into the secure space, completely unrecognizable from the slick, arrogant corporate executive who had confidently stood in my hallway just 24 hours earlier. His tailored navy suit was severely torn and stained with sweat, his tie hanging loosely around his neck like a frayed noose. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and completely unhinged, radiating the absolute feral desperation of a cornered predator realizing his trap had spectacularly failed. He had somehow discovered the location of the transaction, understanding immediately that the syndicate intended to legally seize the property outright rather than absolve his catastrophic gambling debt. Darian did not issue a verbal warning or attempt to negotiate with the massive enforcer sitting across the table. Operating on pure, unrestrained survival instinct, my son-in-law raised a sleek silver semi-automatic handgun, gripping the weapon with violently trembling hands. He bypassed the trained mob enforcer, entirely pivoting his stance and leveling the dark, lethal barrel of the pistol directly between my eyes. He screamed with a ragged, hysterical fury, ordering me to drop the pen immediately and step away from the documents. Spittle flew from his lips as he aggressively declared that the financial deal was entirely dead. Darian commanded absolute control over the chaotic room, explicitly threatening to pull the trigger and paint the mahogany table with my blood if I finalized the signature that would legally transfer his only remaining lifeline to the international syndicate. The deafening roar of Darian's intrusion instantly shattered the manufactured calm of the conference room. The massive mob enforcer did not flinch or cower at the sight of the silver handgun leveled in his general direction. Instead, a mask of pure, unadulterated fury twisted his heavily tattooed features. He immediately recognized that Darian's hysterical outburst had catastrophically compromised a highly sensitive, multi-million-dollar international money laundering operation. Moving with a terrifying speed that completely belied his massive physical bulk, the enforcer reached beneath the tailored fabric of his charcoal jacket. He drew a heavy, matte black, heavy-caliber pistol and aggressively tracked the barrel straight toward Darian's chest. The air in the room grew instantly toxic, thick with the sharp tang of adrenaline and impending violence. The enforcer bellowed at my son-in-law, his voice a booming, guttural roar that violently vibrated against the expensive acoustic paneling of the law office. He ruthlessly berated Darian for drawing a weapon on a superior syndicate associate and jeopardizing the physical cash sitting vulnerable on the table. He explicitly declared that Darian had just signed his own death warrant by bringing chaos into a sanctioned syndicate transaction. Darian's eyes darted wildly between the dark barrel of the enforcer's weapon and the unmoving target of my face. His breathing grew shallow and ragged, his chest heaving as the absolute reality of his fatal miscalculation finally crashed down upon him. He was completely trapped between the uncompromising wrath of an international criminal organization and the cold, unyielding presence of the man he had spent months trying to destroy. The standoff locked all three of us into a deadly, highly volatile triangle where a single twitch of a nervous finger would inevitably result in immediate, catastrophic bloodshed spilling across the polished floor. I did not wait for the inevitable crossfire to completely annihilate the room. The moment Darian's panicked gaze shifted momentarily toward the shouting mob enforcer, I exploited the critical tactical opening. I dropped my center of gravity, braced my heavy combat boots against the solid hardwood floorboards, and launched a devastating front kick directly into the thick pedestal of the heavy mahogany and glass conference table. The massive piece of furniture lurched violently forward with immense kinetic force, acting as an improvised battering ram. The thick glass edge slammed brutally into Darian's midsection, forcefully driving the breath from his lungs and pinning his lower body firmly against the reinforced drywall behind him. The sudden agonizing impact caused his arms to flail wildly as he desperately fought to maintain his grip on the silver handgun. I vaulted cleanly over the corner of the pinned table, closing the physical distance before his compromised nervous system could properly process the rapid counterattack. I bypassed his frantic, uncoordinated defense and secured a vice-like grip around his weapon arm. Relying on decades of ingrained close-quarters combat engineering, I executed a brutal, highly precise joint lock directly onto his right wrist. I twisted the delicate bone structure upward and sharply outward, applying maximum torque against the natural rotation of the joint. Darian released a shrill, agonizing scream as the physical pressure reached the absolute breaking point. His fingers involuntarily spasmed and opened wide, dropping the silver pistol harmlessly onto the carpeted floor. I drove my elbow sharply into his exposed sternum, collapsing his airway and instantly neutralizing his capacity for physical resistance. My son-in-law slumped heavily over the shattered glass surface, completely disarmed, physically incapacitated, and entirely stripped of the arrogant leverage he had ruthlessly wielded against my family. The heavy double doors of the observation suite kicked open just as Darian's silver pistol hit the floorboards. Hector breached the chaotic environment with ruthless, synchronized precision, flanked instantly by a heavily armed federal strike team. The tactical unit flooded the compromised conference room, their assault rifles raised and laser sights tracking every potential hostile movement. The deafening commands of federal agents commanding total submission filled the air, completely overpowering the groans of my incapacitated son-in-law. Two armored agents converged on the towering mob enforcer before he could redirect his weapon toward the entry team. They tackled his massive frame to the ground, slamming his face onto the polished hardwood and brutally wrenching his heavily tattooed arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of heavy tactical restraints echoed sharply as they permanently neutralized the syndicate's primary operator. A second element of the strike team moved aggressively toward the glass table, hauling Darian off the shattered surface and slamming him face first against the adjacent wall. They swiftly disarmed him of any secondary weapons, securing his wrists in heavy steel cuffs, while reading him a rapid, unyielding litany of federal charges ranging from attempted murder to high-level international extortion. Hector stepped over the scattered debris and secured the two reinforced briefcases overflowing with unlaundered syndicate cash, sealing the primary physical evidence of the money laundering operation. I stood slowly from my combat stance, smoothing the lapels of my jacket while watching the federal agents systematically dismantle the immediate physical threat. The oppressive, terrifying shadow Darian had violently cast over my daughter's life was entirely eradicated in a matter of seconds. The tactical sting operation had executed flawlessly, capturing the absolute apex of the criminal conspiracy and rendering both hostiles completely powerless inside a secure federal perimeter. The adrenaline of the successful extraction rapidly faded as the lead federal agent stepped away from the secured prisoners and turned his attention directly toward me. He did not offer a handshake of gratitude or acknowledge the extreme personal risk I had just undertaken to deliver a premier international money laundering syndicate directly into their jurisdiction. The agent fixed me with an expression of pure, unadulterated bureaucratic coldness. He produced a thick stack of official federal warrants from his tactical vest, the harsh black text outlining a devastating legal reality. He looked me squarely in the eye and delivered a calculated, devastating administrative strike. He explicitly informed me that the sheer complexity and monumental scale of the syndicate's financial infiltration had entirely compromised my legal standing. Because Darian had successfully forged my signature on the initial suburban property mortgage and utilized my identity to interface with the underground gambling network, the federal government viewed my entire estate as a potential criminal apparatus. The agent bluntly declared that every single financial asset bearing my name, my social security number, or my biometric signature was now officially classified as active evidence in an ongoing federal racketeering investigation. This sweeping mandate did not just apply to the compromised suburban house or the specific accounts Darian had targeted. The merciless government order explicitly included the impenetrable blind trust Mitchell had constructed to protect my life savings. The agent confirmed that my entire accumulated wealth, my retirement funds, and every cent I had earned through decades of military service were now indefinitely seized and completely locked behind federal barricades. I stood in the center of the shattered conference room, processing the catastrophic realization that while I had successfully saved my daughter's life, the tactical victory had suddenly rendered me entirely brutally penniless. The sheer shock of the bureaucratic seizure had completely paralyzed my financial mobility, forcing me to rely strictly on the physical cash I carried in my jacket pocket. I guided Kendra through the rain-soaked parking lot of a decaying, unbranded motel located on the absolute fringes of the city's industrial district. The neon vacancy sign buzzed with a harsh, erratic electrical hum, casting a sickly red glow across the damp asphalt and reflecting off the pooling water. I paid the night manager for a single room, handing over a crumpled $20 bill and receiving a heavy brass key in return. The interior of the room was a complete sensory assault of stale cigarette smoke mildew and harsh industrial bleach. Peeling floral wallpaper curled away from the damp drywall, and a swarm of cockroaches scattered aggressively beneath the rotting baseboards the moment I flicked on the single overhead bulb. I secured the deadbolt, wedged a heavy wooden chair under the doorknob for tactical reinforcement, and guided Kendra toward the sagging mattress. She collapsed onto the faded bedspread, pulling her knees to her chest in a tight defensive posture while staring blankly at the stained ceiling. I stood by the cracked window, staring out at the desolate highway, and pulled the remaining currency from my pockets. I arranged the damp, crinkled bills and loose silver coins across the scratched veneer of the nightstand. $3.47. I methodically counted the copper and silver discs twice to ensure absolute mathematical accuracy. It was a staggering, humiliating reality to process. 40 years of relentless military discipline, decades of meticulous financial planning, and a lifetime of grueling labor had been entirely eradicated by a single federal seizure order. I was standing in a roach-infested room with less than $4 to my name, tasked with defending my traumatized daughter from an international criminal syndicate and navigating a deeply compromised legal system without a fraction of my resources. The harsh reality of our financial ruin was immediately eclipsed by a terrifying physiological crisis rapidly developing on the sagging motel bed. Kendra began to tremble violently, her teeth chattering with a fierce intensity that had absolutely nothing to do with the freezing ambient temperature of the unheated room. A thick, unhealthy layer of cold sweat coated her pale forehead, and her breathing deteriorated into rapid, shallow gasps that bordered on hyperventilation. I recognized the severe, unmistakable neurological markers of acute chemical withdrawal immediately. My former combat medic training overrode my paternal panic as I knelt beside the mattress, checking her erratic pulse and severely dilated pupils. Kendra choked out fragmented apologies, claiming her mind felt entirely fractured and her nerves were burning beneath her skin like raw electricity. I mentally traced the trajectory of her recent lethargy, her unnatural submissiveness during the violent home invasion, and the thick mental fog that had clouded her judgment for the past 6 months. The horrifying tactical truth snapped into absolute focus with sickening clarity. Darian had not merely broken her spirit through relentless emotional abuse and psychological isolation. He had been actively and systematically poisoning her physiology. He had secretly dissolved high-grade, heavy, anti-anxiety pharmaceutical compounds directly into her daily meals and morning coffee. He had intentionally kept his own wife chemically tethered, highly docile, and chronically confused to ensure she could never intellectually challenge his forged signatures or question the massive hemorrhaging of their joint bank accounts. Darian had weaponized prescription narcotics to construct a compliant, unresisting hostage inside his own home. Now that she was abruptly severed from the daily toxic dosage, her central nervous system was experiencing a catastrophic, completely unmanaged crash. I held her violently, shaking hands, applying firm pressure to ground her reality, realizing I desperately needed immediate medical supplies to stabilize her failing neurochemistry before she went into full cardiac arrest. I could not afford the luxury of waiting for the commercial banks to open or begging federal agents for temporary financial relief. My daughter required clean hydration, electrolyte stabilization, and over-the-counter medical supplies immediately to survive the brutal physical withdrawal process tearing through her body. I locked Kendra safely inside the motel room, instructing her to stay absolutely flat on the bed and away from the windows, and sprinted 2 miles down the desolate industrial corridor toward a sprawling commercial meat processing facility. The heavy loading docks were highly active, illuminated by harsh halogen floodlights as massive refrigerated transport trucks backed into the concrete bays. I bypassed the formal employment office and approached the dock foreman, directly demanding an immediate under-the-table cash shift loading heavy cargo. The foreman took one look at my rigid, determined posture and handed me a pair of thick, insulated thermal gloves without asking for a single piece of identification. For the next 8 consecutive hours, I subjected my aging body to absolute physical torture. I hauled 80-pound crates of frozen commercial livestock from the sub-zero storage lockers directly into the idling transport vehicles. The ambient temperature inside the industrial freezer hovered near 0 degrees, biting viciously through my thin jacket and turning my heavy breathing into thick clouds of white vapor. The rough cardboard boxes shredded the skin on my forearms, and my lower back screamed in protest with every violent pivot. But I completely compartmentalized the agonizing physical pain. I visualized Kendra shivering in that damp motel room, utilizing the primal surge of paternal duty to fuel my exhausted, freezing muscles. I refused to break. I refused to let Darian's calculated destruction dictate my ultimate failure. When the morning shift whistle finally blew, the foreman handed me $60 in crumpled cash. I marched straight to an all-night pharmacy, securing the vital supplies to keep my daughter alive. The harsh morning sunlight was just beginning to penetrate the grimy motel window when a sharp, authoritative knock echoed aggressively against the thin wooden door. I immediately shifted into a defensive stance, gripping a heavy metal pipe I had scavenged from the alleyway during my return trip, and approached the entryway with absolute silence. I checked the distorted peephole and recognized the sharp, tailored silhouette of Mitchell standing in the damp exterior corridor. I disengaged the deadbolt and pulled the door open quickly, ushering the seasoned attorney inside before securing the perimeter lock. Mitchell did not offer a polite morning greeting or ask about our temporary living conditions. He looked physically exhausted, his tie loosened, and a thick manila folder clutched tightly in his right hand. He stepped past the scattered medical supplies on the nightstand and handed me a dense stack of official court summons, his expression grim and completely devoid of his usual legal optimism. He informed me that our tactical victory at the law firm had immediately triggered a massive, highly coordinated legal counterattack from Darian's remaining criminal infrastructure. The corrupt neurologist who had originally diagnosed my fabricated dementia had just filed a massive multi-million-dollar civil defamation lawsuit against me. The compromised physician claimed that my aggressive actions and public accusations had catastrophically destroyed his prestigious medical practice and ruined his professional reputation across the city. Mitchell explicitly clarified the brutal tactical reality of this sudden maneuver. The lawsuit was not actually about recovering financial damages. It was a highly weaponized legal strike specifically designed to entirely obliterate my personal credibility and character on public record. If the neurologist successfully branded me as a paranoid defamatory and unstable aggressor in a civil court, the federal prosecutors would be forced to completely disqualify me as a reliable star witness against Darian and the international money laundering syndicate. My entire fight for justice was on the verge of total collapse. The harsh reality of my frozen financial assets meant a conventional legal defense was an absolute impossibility. Fighting a multi-million-dollar defamation lawsuit in a civil courtroom requires a formidable team of highly paid attorneys, endless billable hours, and massive retainer fees that I simply could not generate loading frozen meat for minimum wage. If the corrupt neurologist succeeded in dragging this fabricated case before a judge, he would systematically dismantle my credibility on the public record. That civil victory would provide Darian's defense attorneys with the exact legal ammunition needed to disqualify me as the primary federal witness in the money laundering trial. I sat across from Hector at the small scratch table inside the motel room, mapping out an aggressive counteroffensive. We could not afford to fight the doctor within the traditional expensive boundaries of the civil justice system. Therefore, we needed to permanently obliterate his professional reputation and completely neutralize his medical authority before the lawsuit could even proceed to the discovery phase. A predator who fabricates terminal dementia diagnoses for profit does not operate in total isolation. Medical fraud on that specific highly clinical scale requires complicit staff-altered digital records and a heavily guarded paper trail. I tasked Hector with utilizing his extensive underground intelligence network to deeply audit the neurologist's private medical clinic. We needed to identify a critical vulnerability within his administrative infrastructure, a disgruntled employee, or a marginalized whistleblower who possessed direct, unmediated access to the clinic's darkest operational secrets. We were going to bypass the expensive civil litigation entirely and execute a targeted, devastating strike against the very foundation of the corrupt doctor's medical license. Hector's intelligence gathering yielded a highly actionable target within 48 hours. He identified a senior clinical triage nurse who had been abruptly and ruthlessly terminated from the neurologist's private practice just 3 weeks prior. Official clinic records cited vague administrative insubordination, but Hector's background check revealed she had quietly filed multiple ignored grievances regarding severe ethical violations and unauthorized alterations to patient charts. I intercepted the nurse just after dusk as she walked heavily toward her compact vehicle in the dimly lit parking lot of a discount grocery store. I did not ambush her with aggressive intimidation or attempt to leverage the terrifying reality of the mob syndicate. I stepped into the pale glow of the street lamp, keeping my hands visible and my posture entirely non-threatening. I introduced myself simply as Kendra's father, speaking directly to her suppressed conscience and her fundamental human decency. I detailed the exact horrifying timeline of how her former employer had intentionally fabricated a terminal neurological diagnosis to help a violent criminal chemically lobotomize my daughter. I described Kendra's current physical agony, explaining the brutal reality of the severe pharmaceutical withdrawals she was enduring on a sagging motel mattress because a greedy doctor had monetized his medical oath. I did not speak to her as a tactical operative or a desperate defendant in a civil lawsuit. I spoke to her strictly as an aging, deeply terrified father, desperately fighting to keep his only child alive against overwhelming catastrophic odds. I looked directly into her tired eyes and told her that she possessed the absolute power to dismantle the precise machinery that was systematically destroying innocent families across the city. I asked her to stop running from the guilt of her silence and finally help me burn the corrupt clinic to the ground. The raw, unvarnished truth of a father's desperation shattered the heavy wall of self-preservation the nurse had built around herself. Tears pooled in her eyes as she finally surrendered the paralyzing guilt she had carried for years. She reached into her heavy leather tote bag and retrieved a highly encrypted solid-state digital drive, pressing the cold metal firmly into the palm of my hand. She revealed that prior to her sudden termination, she had meticulously downloaded the clinic's entire shadow database. The drive contained a staggering, undeniable 10-year digital ledger documenting a highly systematic and incredibly lucrative criminal enterprise. The neurologist had been actively partnering with predatory relatives, utilizing his prestigious medical credentials to authorize completely fraudulent psychiatric holds and fabricate irreversible cognitive decline diagnoses. He had personally engineered the medical framework required to legally strip dozens of vulnerable, elderly patients of their civil rights, allowing their greedy families to ruthlessly liquidate their massive private estates. In exchange for providing the bulletproof medical documentation, the doctor received massive, untraceable kickbacks filtered through offshore shell corporations. I did not take this devastating intelligence to Mitchell or attempt to use it as leverage to dismiss the civil lawsuit. I drove straight to the heavily fortified federal building downtown and placed the encrypted ledger directly into the hands of the lead FBI agent coordinating Darian's racketeering case. The sheer magnitude of the medical fraud provided the federal government with a massive, unprecedented expansion of their criminal investigation. The civil defamation suit against me instantly evaporated as the FBI dispatched a heavily armed tactical unit to raid the neurologist's private clinic, immediately arresting him for severe federal healthcare fraud, criminal conspiracy, and direct complicity in organized elder abuse. The immediate deployment of the federal medical fraud indictments drastically altered my legal standing with the government. Recognizing my vital instrumental role in exposing the massive criminal network, The federal prosecutor officially and permanently lifted the catastrophic bureaucratic freeze on my personal assets. The blind trust was immediately reactivated and my entire life savings instantly flooded back into my secure digital accounts. We were no longer trapped in a decaying, roach-infested motel room surviving on the meager wages of an industrial meat freezer. However, the profound relief of our financial resurrection was brutally severed before the sun even cleared the city skyline. My secure cellular phone rang sharply, displaying Mitchell's encrypted caller identification. I answered the line, expecting a routine update on the doctor's federal arraignment, but the attorney's voice was strained, breathless, and laced with absolute, unadulterated panic. He delivered a horrifying tactical update that completely shattered our brief illusion of safety. Darian had not remained securely locked inside his maximum security federal holding cell. His deep connections to the international gambling syndicate had provided a lethal contingency plan. Utilizing a highly sophisticated, entirely anonymous dark web cryptocurrency account, unknown foreign operatives had successfully transferred millions of dollars in untraceable digital assets to post Darian's massive federal bail. My son-in-law had been officially released from federal custody an hour ago, completely vanishing from the government's operational grid the moment he stepped past the prison gates. Mitchell warned me with absolute certainty that Darian was not fleeing the jurisdiction or attempting to escape the impending trial. He was actively hunting Kendra, knowing her direct physical testimony was the final nail required to seal his federal conviction. The ultimate predator was loose on the streets, heavily funded, completely unrestrained, and coming directly for my daughter. The chilling reality of Darian's sudden release entirely altered the operational landscape, transforming my son-in-law from a cornered corporate criminal into a highly funded, completely unrestrained apex predator. A man facing decades in a federal penitentiary with absolute mob backing, has zero moral boundaries and absolutely nothing left to lose. Mitchell's frantic warning confirmed my worst tactical fear. Darian would bypass all legal protocols and violently hunt Kendra down to permanently silence her upcoming federal testimony. I refused to let my daughter remain exposed on the open board for a single second longer. I gripped Kendra by the shoulders, looking into her exhausted eyes, and promised her absolute safety before transferring her entirely into Hector's custody. Hector utilized his deepest, most classified underground connections, bypassing all standard federal safe houses entirely. He secured an absolute lockdown facility managed by a highly specialized team of heavily armed, fiercely loyal private contractors. The location was a fortified subterranean bunker completely invisible to digital tracking networks, physical surveillance, and syndicate infiltration. Kendra wept as the armored transport vehicle arrived, begging me not to engage Darian alone, but I offered no false reassurances. I simply closed the heavy steel door of the transport, watching the armored truck vanish into the dark city streets. With my daughter completely removed from the blast radius, the heavy burden of paternal anxiety vanished from my chest, immediately replaced by a cold, calculating military resolve. I was no longer an aging father desperately trying to shield his broken family from a collapsing financial infrastructure. I was a fully unencumbered combat veteran preparing to dictate the terms of the final battlefield. I had to force Darian to focus his lethal, desperate attention entirely on me tonight. I needed to execute a precise, undeniable maneuver to draw the enemy away from the populated city grid and entirely on my terms. I bypassed the sleek, modern rental vehicles scattered around the motel parking lot and retrieved my old battered pickup truck from a secure lockup. The rusting machine possessed a heavy block engine and absolutely zero modern electronic navigation systems, making it a perfect tactical ghost on the open road. I slid behind the cracked steering wheel, reaching into my jacket to retrieve the encrypted cellular phone the federal agents had recently reactivated. I deliberately disabled the advanced security protocols and actively engaged the primary GPS tracking transponder. I effectively transformed the device into a blindingly bright digital beacon, broadcasting my exact real-time geographical coordinates directly into the dark web networks Darian was currently utilizing. I slammed the heavy transmission into gear and drove aggressively out of the urban sprawl, heading deep into the treacherous, winding roads of the northern mountain range. My destination was a highly isolated, forgotten hunting cabin situated miles away from paved roads or cellular relay towers. Naomi and I had purchased the remote, heavily wooded acreage exactly 30 years ago, seeking a quiet sanctuary far removed from the noise of civilization. The property was completely devoid of modern utilities, surrounded by dense pine forests and sheer granite drops that formed a natural, highly defensible perimeter. I intentionally left a clear, unmistakable digital trail charting a direct course straight to the abandoned structure. I was actively inviting a monster into the deep woods, fully intending to ensure he never walked back out. The freezing mountain air whipped through the cracked windows of the truck as the elevation climbed sharply, clearing my mind for the impending violence. I navigated the treacherous dirt switchbacks entirely by muscle memory, pulling the heavy truck into the overgrown clearing just as the moon crested the jagged peaks. The interior of the ancient cabin was suffocatingly silent, smelling heavily of dry rot, ancient pine needles, and undisturbed dust. I did not attempt to ignite the old stone fireplace or activate any battery-powered lanterns. I allowed the heavy freezing mountain darkness to completely envelop the single room, turning the tactical environment into a pitch-black void. I dragged a solid, heavy oak chair directly into the dead center of the floorboards, positioning myself in direct alignment with the reinforced front entryway. I sat down in the absolute quiet, resting my hands lightly on my knees, and forced my breathing into a slow, rhythmic, highly controlled cadence. My eyes gradually adjusted to the dense shadows, mapping the precise distances between the doorway, the shattered windows, and my seated position. The agonizingly slow passage of time did not erode my focus or trigger any latent anxiety. I utilized the profound isolation to mentally lock away all remaining traces of empathy, fully embracing the cold, calculated patience required to execute a fatal ambush. The deep forest remained perfectly still for 3 consecutive hours before the inevitable disruption finally occurred. The low, aggressive, unmistakable rumble of a heavy-duty combustion engine tore violently through the quiet canopy of the surrounding trees. The sound echoed off the granite walls, growing steadily louder as a hostile vehicle navigated the unpaved mountain switchbacks. Twin beams of blinding high-intensity halogen headlights suddenly swept across the boarded-up windows, casting long, erratic shadows across the dusty floorboards of the cabin. The heavy engine idled roughly in the overgrown clearing just outside the front steps. The digital bait had worked flawlessly. The predator had arrived. Heavy, aggressive footsteps crunched violently against the loose gravel outside the structure, devoid of any stealth or tactical hesitation. The thick wooden door of the cabin was suddenly kicked open with explosive, unrestrained force. The rusted iron hinges shrieked in protest as the heavy panel slammed into the interior wall, allowing a freezing gust of mountain wind to rush into the dark room. Darian stepped directly into the threshold, his silhouette heavily backlit by the harsh halogen headlights of his idling vehicle. He had completely shed his tailored corporate suits, now wearing dark, heavy tactical clothing and gripping a short-barreled pump-action shotgun with white-knuckled intensity. His eyes were wide, manic, and reflecting the absolute unhinged desperation of a man entirely cornered by his own catastrophic failures. However, my son-in-law did not enter the isolated killing zone alone. With a sudden vicious jerk of his left arm, Darian dragged a sobbing, heavily bruised man across the threshold, violently tossing the terrified hostage onto the dusty floorboards at my feet. I stared at the weeping, bloodied figure and immediately recognized his terrified face. It was the deeply corrupt public notary who had originally authorized the forged loan documents against my suburban property. Darian racked the heavy slide of the shotgun with a deafening metallic clack, leveling the lethal weapon squarely at my chest. He barked a manic, breathless command, explicitly declaring his ultimate, desperate endgame. He intended to force my physical signature onto a completely new ironclad asset transfer document, under the direct threat of immediate execution. He had forcefully abducted the corrupt official to provide an unimpeachable, legally binding seal to the transaction, completely determined to secure the mob's stolen millions before permanently burying us both beneath the freezing mountain dirt tonight. The freezing steel of the shotgun barrel pressed violently against the center of my forehead, forcing my head back against the rigid wooden slats of the heavy oak chair. Darian's breath washed over my face, reeking of stale adrenaline, cheap alcohol, and raw panic. He did not pull the trigger immediately. Instead, he yanked the weapon away and began pacing the narrow confines of the hunting cabin like a rabid animal trapped inside a steel cage. He kicked a fallen stool out of his path and launched into a manic, breathless monologue, entirely unable to contain his twisted, arrogant pride. He boasted about the absolute ease with which he had systematically dismantled my daughter's reality, laughing a sharp, hysterical laugh that echoed harshly off the exposed timber walls. He detailed exactly how he had manipulated Kendra's unwavering trust, slipping heavy pharmaceuticals into her morning coffee to keep her compliant and thoroughly confused while he drained her joint accounts and isolated her from the outside world. He mocked my lifelong military discipline, sneering that my decades of careful financial planning and rigid moral codes were completely worthless against his modern corporate ruthlessness. He genuinely believed he had outsmarted both the federal government and an international crime syndicate simultaneously. He threw the fresh, legally binding asset transfer documents forcefully onto my lap, declaring that once my signature secured the release of the blind trust, the mob would definitively forgive his massive gambling debts and allow him to walk away a completely free man. He pointed the shotgun barrel directly at the sobbing, bloodied notary, bleeding on the floorboards, demanding I execute the transfer immediately or watch the terrified official die before receiving the exact same fatal treatment myself. I did not flinch, beg for my life, or attempt to negotiate with a man who had completely surrendered his humanity to greed and chemical addiction. My military training demanded absolute stillness in the face of an active, highly unstable threat. I kept my breathing measured and shallow, allowing Darian to exhaust his manic energy while I carefully evaluated the precise geometry of the room. The terrified public notary continued to weep quietly on the dusty floorboards, clutching his bruised ribs and waiting for an execution that seemed entirely inevitable. I slowly lowered my gaze to the thick legal documents resting on my knees. The paperwork was meticulously drafted, clearly designed to permanently transfer the entirety of my newly unlocked federal assets directly into an untraceable corporate holding shell controlled by Darian. I reached slowly into the interior pocket of my heavy jacket, ensuring my movements were highly telegraphed and completely non-threatening to prevent Darian from reacting with a sudden, fatal trigger pull. I withdrew a heavy silver fountain pen, the cool metal grounding my focus. Without uttering a single word of protest or defiance, I uncapped the pen and pressed the gold nib against the crisp white paper. I smoothly and deliberately signed my full legal name on every single required signature line, executing the precise biometric flourishes necessary to authenticate the massive transfer of wealth. I gathered the signed documents, squared the edges with meticulous care, and leaned forward to place the completed stack squarely onto the center of the scratched wooden table. I rested the silver pen precisely on top of the paperwork, visually signaling total compliance. Darian released a ragged, triumphant gasp, genuinely believing he had finally broken my spirit and secured his ultimate bloody victory. I sat back in the heavy oak chair, lacing my fingers together and looking directly into Darian's bloodshot, manic eyes. I did not possess the billions of dollars he thought he had just successfully extorted, but I possessed something infinitely more lethal. I maintained absolute eye contact and informed my son-in-law that he had fundamentally miscalculated the entire tactical environment. I casually gestured upward toward the ceiling, directing his attention to the 4 heavy plastic smoke detectors mounted in the dark corners of the wooden beams. I explicitly clarified that those devices were not standard fire safety equipment installed decades ago. They were military-grade high-definition broadcast lenses, equipped with highly sensitive omnidirectional acoustic microphones. Hector had spent the previous afternoon wiring the abandoned hunting cabin with top-tier federal surveillance technology, turning my isolated mountain sanctuary into a heavily fortified digital trap. I watched the triumphant smirk instantly dissolve from Darian's sweaty face as I calmly explained the catastrophic reality of his current situation. I informed him that every single word of his arrogant, breathless monologue had just been captured in pristine audio and high-definition video. His detailed confession regarding the chemical poisoning of my daughter, his vast international money laundering schemes, and his violent abduction of a licensed public notary had just been live-streamed directly to a secure, heavily encrypted federal server. The FBI strike team monitoring the feed from the city had already cataloged the irrefutable evidence required to lock him in a federal penitentiary for multiple consecutive lifetimes. I pointed to the signed documents resting on the table and coldly stated that the paper was entirely worthless, serving only as the final piece of physical bait required to permanently seal his inevitable, inescapable doom. The absolute crushing weight of the federal trap shattered the last remaining fragments of Darian's fragile sanity. A terrifying, inhuman sound ripped from his throat, a primal scream of pure, unrestrained rage and utter catastrophic defeat. He realized instantly that the syndicate would slaughter him for losing their money and the federal government would cage him forever for his extensive crimes. Having absolutely nothing left to lose, Darian completely snapped. He violently racked the pump-action shotgun and pivoted sharply toward the sobbing public notary huddled on the floorboards. He did not hesitate or issue a single demand. He leveled the heavy barrel and executed the unarmed official at point-blank range, the deafening blast completely rupturing the suffocating silence of the mountain cabin. The brutal kinetic force threw the man backward, instantly neutralizing the only other civilian witness in the room. I launched myself from the oak chair muscles, coiling to strike, but Darian was already moving with the chaotic, unpredictable speed of a cornered maniac. He kicked the wooden table backward to block my advance and snatched a heavy metal canister of industrial lighter fluid from a nearby shelf. He ripped the plastic nozzle off with his teeth and began frantically dousing the dry, exposed timber walls of the cabin, splashing the highly flammable chemical accelerant across the floorboards, the scattered documents, and directly onto my heavy jacket. He dropped the empty canister, his chest heaving as he pulled a simple book of matches from his tactical vest. Darian stared at me through the suffocating fumes, his eyes wide and burning with absolute suicidal madness. He struck the match against the abrasive paper, the tiny flare illuminating his twisted smile, fully intending to burn me and the digital evidence to ashes. The tiny flare of this match descended in a slow, terrifying arc before making contact with the volatile chemical accelerant pooled across the floorboards. The ignition was completely instantaneous and violently explosive. A massive wall of searing orange flame erupted upward, instantly catching the dry, exposed timber of the cabin walls and spreading with unnatural speed. Darian did not stay to watch the execution. He immediately spun on his heel and sprinted backward out the front entryway, slamming the heavy wooden door shut behind him. I heard the sharp, unmistakable scrape of heavy metal dragging across the exterior porch, followed by the solid thud of a reinforced steel brace wedging the door permanently into its frame. He was barricading the only conventional exit, sealing me inside a rapidly deteriorating wooden oven. The heat inside the single room spiked to an absolutely agonizing degree within seconds. The flames greedily consumed the ancient pine needles and rotted wood, generating a thick, highly toxic cloud of pitch-black smoke that immediately blanketed the upper half of the room. The oxygen was violently sucked from the air, replaced entirely by searing carbon and chemical fumes. I coughed violently, my lungs burning as the suffocating smoke assaulted my respiratory system. The intense heat blistered the exposed skin on my face and hands, forcing me to shield my eyes against the blinding glare of the inferno. The blazing structure roared with a deafening, monstrous intensity, entirely drowning out the sound of Darian's manic laughter echoing from the other side of the barricaded door. The entire cabin was rapidly transforming into a localized firestorm, and my biological capacity to survive the oxygen depletion was dropping to absolute zero. I immediately dropped my chest flush against the dusty floorboards, pressing my face into the narrow, relatively clear pocket of breathable oxygen hovering just inches above the ground. My military survival instincts ruthlessly overrode the rising physiological panic, forcing my brain to rapidly analyze the tactical geometry of the burning structure. I knew every single architectural detail of this isolated sanctuary because Naomi and I had meticulously restored the foundation decades ago. I explicitly remembered a critical structural weakness located in the far rear corner of the room, a specific section of the foundational grid where the underlying joists had succumbed to severe water damage and extensive wood rot. I dragged my body aggressively across the splintered wood, navigating blindly through the dense smoke and the searing waves of heat radiating from the burning walls. My searching hands scoured the stone perimeter of the dormant fireplace until my fingers closed around the cold, heavy iron shaft of an antique fire poker. Gripping the improvised breaching tool with both hands, I crawled rapidly toward the compromised rear corner. The flames were already licking at my heavy jacket, threatening to ignite the fabric at any second. I raised the heavy iron tool and brought it crashing down against the rotted pine planks with every ounce of kinetic force my aging muscles could generate. The compromised wood splintered and cracked under the violent, repeated impacts. I struck the floorboards again and again, establishing a steady, brutal rhythm against the deafening roar of the surrounding fire. The thick planks finally yielded with a sharp, echoing snap, shattering inward and revealing a narrow, jagged opening plunging directly into the pitch-black void beneath the foundational frame. I did not hesitate to force my shoulders through the jagged, splintered opening in the floorboards. I dropped heavily into the damp, freezing darkness of the narrow subterranean crawl space just as a massive section of the interior ceiling surrendered to the flames and crashed onto the exact spot where I had been laying seconds prior. The crawl space was horrifyingly restrictive, offering less than 2 feet of vertical clearance between the muddy earth and the rapidly igniting foundational joists directly above my head. The ambient temperature in the confined cavity was rising exponentially, turning the damp soil into a suffocating muddy sauna. I dragged my body forward using my elbows and knees, fighting through thick, sticky curtains of ancient spiderwebs and absolute darkness. The heavy timber beams above me groaned and cracked in agonizing protest as the structural integrity of the cabin completely failed under the intense thermal load. Hot embers and burning debris rained down through the widening gaps in the floorboards, singing my jacket and burning my neck as I clawed my way toward the exterior foundational wall. I finally reached the heavy iron ventilation grate set into the stone perimeter. I braced my boots against the muddy earth, gripped the rusted metal bars with both hands, and violently kicked my legs forward. The rusted masonry anchors sheared away from the stone, launching the heavy iron grate out into the freezing mountain air. I violently propelled my body through the narrow opening, tumbling out onto the wet, overgrown brush of the forest floor just as the entire wooden roof of the cabin collapsed inward, sending a massive, blinding pillar of sparks and orange flame shooting directly into the night sky. I collapsed heavily into the freezing, damp underbrush, gasping violently for clean, uncompromised oxygen, while the towering inferno illuminated the dark forest in a harsh, flickering orange glow. I remained entirely motionless in the dense shadows, watching through the overgrown foliage as Darian celebrated his fabricated victory. He stood near the edge of the clearing, completely bathed in the light of the burning cabin, staring at the collapsing structure with absolute triumphant satisfaction. He genuinely believed he had eradicated the final obstacle to his absolute freedom and permanently destroyed the digital ledger condemning him to federal prison. Moving with arrogant, unhurried confidence, Darian approached my battered, idling pickup truck. He climbed into the driver's seat, slamming the heavy metal door shut, and aggressively shifted the transmission into gear. The heavy block engine roared as he accelerated violently out of the clearing, the taillights disappearing rapidly down the treacherous, winding mountain switchbacks. He was speeding back toward the city grid, absolutely convinced he had won the war and secured his unhindered return to the international criminal syndicate. I slowly pushed myself up from the freezing mud, brushing the damp soil from my singed jacket while watching the faint glow of the headlights fade into the dense tree line. Darian was currently reveling in the intoxicating thrill of his perceived survival, completely unaware of the lethal tactical reality waiting for him in the darkness. Exactly 2 miles down the solitary unpaved mountain road, perfectly concealed around a blind high-speed hairpin turn, Hector was calmly waiting in the freezing shadows, kneeling patiently beside the asphalt with a fully deployed military-grade titanium spike strip. The heavy block engine of the stolen pickup truck roared through the freezing mountain air as Darian recklessly accelerated the massive vehicle down the treacherous, unpaved switchbacks. He was driving entirely blind to the tactical reality of his situation, pushing the archaic transmission well past 70 miles per hour in a desperate bid to escape the burning cabin and reach the safety of the urban grid. His arrogant assumption of victory completely blinded him to the darkness ahead. Exactly 2 miles down the descent, concealed perfectly within the shadows of a blind, high-speed hairpin turn, Hector's military-grade titanium spike strip waited. The heavy reinforced rubber tires of the accelerating truck struck the staggered metal teeth with absolutely devastating kinetic force. The hollow percussive explosions of 4 simultaneous blowouts violently shattered the quiet mountain night. The instant loss of traction at extreme velocity transformed the massive vehicle into an uncontrollable multi-ton projectile. The steering column violently snapped, tearing the wheel from Darian's frantic grip as the shredded rubber flailed against the asphalt. The truck lurched sharply to the right, skidding violently across the damp pavement in a shower of brilliant orange sparks before slamming directly into the rusted steel guardrail. The sheer momentum of the heavy chassis instantly sheared the metal barrier from its concrete anchors, folding the reinforced steel like brittle aluminum. The truck launched over the steep, jagged precipice, plunging directly into the deep ravine. The vehicle rolled violently down the steep, heavily wooded embankment, shattering mature pine trees and violently crushing the cabin roof with every brutal impact against the granite boulders. The deafening cacophony of twisting metal, shattering safety glass, and tearing earth finally culminated in a massive ground-shaking thud as the mangled wreck slammed into the muddy floor of the gorge. I did not wait for the dust and pulverized debris to settle before initiating the pursuit. I sprinted down the steep, treacherous incline of the mountain road, my heavy combat boots digging into the loose gravel and tearing through the dense, freezing underbrush. Hector emerged from the deep shadows of the tree line, his expression entirely stoic and calculating, moving with synchronized military precision to flank the crash site. We descended into the dark ravine together, navigating the treacherous terrain until we reached the completely obliterated remains of my pickup truck. The vehicle rested entirely upside down, the crushed cab buried deep in the muddy earth and the engine block hissing violently as hot radiator fluid leaked onto the freezing ground. The pungent, toxic stench of ruptured fuel lines and scorched rubber heavily permeated the mountain air, creating a highly volatile environment. I dropped to my knees, illuminating the interior of the crushed cabin with the harsh, blinding beam of my tactical flashlight. Darian was severely pinned beneath the collapsed steering column, suspended upside down by the locked seatbelt mechanism. A jagged laceration across his forehead bled profusely, sending a thick stream of dark blood pooling onto the shattered glass covering the interior roof. Despite the catastrophic bone-breaking velocity of the crash, the mob enforcer was very much alive. His chest heaved with rapid, ragged breaths, and his fingers twitched erratically as his severely concussed brain struggled to process the total mechanical failure of his escape. Before Hector or I could evaluate the structural integrity of the wreckage to secure the prisoner, the distinct high-pitched wail of state police sirens pierced the freezing night air. The federal task force, utilizing the geographic data streamed from the cabin's surveillance network, was rapidly converging on our exact coordinates. The blinding strobes of red and blue emergency lights quickly flooded the dark ravine, casting long, erratic shadows across the shattered pine trees as an armada of state troopers and federal agents breached the crash site. Highly trained tactical units immediately secured the perimeter with raised assault rifles, establishing a rigid operational barricade around the hissing wreckage. A specialized emergency extraction team swarmed the crushed pickup truck, deploying heavy hydraulic rescue tools to systematically dismantle the mangled steel frame. The deafening mechanical whine of the hydraulic jaws severing the door hinges echoed sharply against the granite walls. The paramedics worked with ruthless, calculated efficiency, cutting away the jammed seatbelt and carefully dragging Darian's battered frame from the crushed interior. They immobilized his spine on a rigid medical backboard, immediately wrapping his bleeding forehead in heavy pressure bandages. Despite his severe physical trauma and the overwhelming presence of heavily armed federal law enforcement, Darian refused to submit quietly. As the troopers violently wrenched his uninjured arms backward to secure heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists, effectively locking him directly to the metal rails of the medical gurney, he snapped his gaze toward me. He ignored the federal agents, reading him a rapid litany of criminal charges, and locked eyes with me through the chaotic swarm of emergency personnel. The look he projected was entirely devoid of fear, remorse, or surrender. It was a stare of pure, unadulterated, venomous hatred. His eyes burned with the manic intensity of a cornered predator, realizing it had been completely outmaneuvered, silently promising absolute catastrophic retribution if he ever managed to break free from his federal restraints. I stood shoulder to shoulder with Hector on the muddy embankment, meeting Darian's lethal stare with absolute, unwavering silence. The extraction team hoisted the heavy medical gurney from the muddy ravine, locking the specialized wheels into the rear bay of the idling, brightly lit ambulance. Darian was entirely secured, physically incapacitated, and surrounded by a dozen armed federal agents, yet he immediately deployed the only tactical weapon he had left in his arsenal. Recognizing that his vast criminal enterprise, his mob protection, and his physical freedom were permanently destroyed, he weaponized his voice to inflict maximum collateral damage. As the paramedics prepared to slam the heavy ambulance doors shut, Darian violently thrashed against his steel restraints and screamed directly at the lead federal investigator. He did not confess or beg for a reduced sentence. Instead, he unleashed a desperate, highly calculated, and entirely fabricated narrative designed to instantly shift the federal crosshairs. He shrieked that the authorities were arresting the wrong target. He hysterically claimed that Kendra, my traumatized and chemically poisoned daughter, was the absolute mastermind behind the entire international money laundering operation. Darian breathlessly shouted that Kendra had meticulously engineered the fraudulent real estate loans, orchestrated the fake dementia diagnosis, and actively managed the underground syndicate accounts. He painted himself as a terrified, unwilling victim, explicitly claiming that Kendra and her criminal associates had forced him to execute the daily fraudulent transfers under the constant lethal threat of his own execution. He screamed that he was merely a hostage carrying out orders to survive. The federal agents immediately stopped writing in their notebooks, their expressions hardening as they processed this massive, unexpected accusation. The ambulance doors slammed shut, cutting off his frantic shouting, but the tactical damage was already done. Darian had successfully planted a highly toxic seed of doubt into the federal investigation, placing a massive lethal target directly onto my daughter's back. 6 months of agonizing legal preparation and intense psychological therapy culminated in the sterile, heavily guarded confines of the federal courtroom. The massive mahogany chamber was packed to absolute capacity, with journalists, federal investigators, and curious onlookers eager to witness the final chapter of the sprawling syndicate trial. Darian sat at the defense table, his face a mask of manufactured innocence projecting the false demeanor of a wrongfully accused victim. His lead defense attorney, a ruthless corporate litigator known for utterly destroying witnesses on the stand, paced aggressively in front of the jury box. He locked his predatory gaze onto Kendra, unleashing a relentless, highly calculated verbal assault designed to entirely obliterate her credibility. The attorney loudly painted my daughter not as a traumatized victim of chemical poisoning and emotional abuse, but as a cold, manipulative mastermind who had deliberately orchestrated her own father's financial destruction to fund a lavish, unchecked lifestyle. He twisted every bank transfer, every forced signature, and every coerced medical document into a fabricated narrative of Kendra's supposed greed, loudly claiming she had framed her innocent husband to escape the legal consequences of her own staggering fraud. Kendra sat rigidly on the witness stand, her pale hands gripping the polished wood of the enclosure with white-knuckled intensity. She trembled visibly under the crushing weight of the attorney's aggressive accusations, her chest heaving as she fought a desperate internal battle to maintain her fragile composure. The courtroom air grew thick with tension as the litigator relentlessly pounded her with rapid-fire questions intentionally designed to trigger a psychological collapse and force a public breakdown before the jury. She squeezed her eyes shut, fighting back tears of sheer panic, struggling to anchor herself against the overwhelming current of Darian's final desperate legal deception. The defense attorney concluded his vicious cross-examination, returning to his seat with an arrogant smirk as Kendra was finally excused from the unbearable pressure of the witness stand. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom remained perfectly still as the federal prosecutor formally called me to testify. I stood up from the front gallery, smoothing the lapels of my dark suit, and walked deliberately toward the elevated platform. I did not glare at Darian or acknowledge the aggressive posturing of his legal team. I remained a pillar of absolute, unwavering stoicism, channeling decades of ingrained military discipline to project a profound, undeniable authority across the silent room. I swore the standard legal oath, took my seat, and met the federal prosecutor's gaze with calm, absolute certainty. The prosecutor began to establish the precise timeline of the mountain cabin ambush and the subsequent vehicle crash, preparing to dismantle the defense's fabricated narrative. Instead of merely answering his preliminary questions, I reached into the breast pocket of my tailored jacket and retrieved a small, highly compromised piece of physical evidence. I extended my hand over the wooden partition, handing the lead prosecutor a severely scorched, half-melted mobile device encased in a clear plastic evidence bag. The damaged piece of technology was completely unrecognizable to the untrained eye, heavily charred from the intense heat of the leaking engine block and crushed by the massive kinetic impact of the rollover. Darian's manufactured confidence instantly evaporated the moment he recognized the melted plastic casing. The arrogant smirk vanished from his face, completely replaced by a sickly, bloodless pallor. He lunged forward in his heavy wooden chair, his eyes wide with absolute suffocating terror, realizing his ultimate secret had somehow survived the violent destruction of the mountain ravine. I spoke in a clear, resonant voice that carried effortlessly to the furthest corners of the silent federal courtroom, explaining the exact origin of the damaged hardware. I detailed how I had descended into the freezing mountain ravine immediately following the violent crash, reaching the crushed cabin of the pickup truck before the state police and emergency extraction teams secured the perimeter. While Darian hung unconscious and bleeding upside down in his seatbelt, I had forcefully ripped his secret, untraceable burner phone directly from a concealed compartment behind the shattered dashboard. The federal prosecutor proudly informed the jury that the FBI's elite cyber division had successfully bypassed the device's thermal damage and military-grade encryption to recover the entire digital storage drive. He walked purposefully toward the center of the room, holding the printed transcripts of the recovered data, and began to read the recovered text messages aloud for the court. The digital ledger contained a highly detailed, deeply horrifying conversation between Darian and an anonymous syndicate assassin. The messages provided absolute, irrefutable proof that Darian had meticulously planned to murder Kendra during their upcoming anniversary trip to Italy. The correspondence outlined a brutal, premeditated conspiracy to stage a tragic boating accident off the Amalfi Coast, ensuring her body would never be recovered. Darian had explicitly instructed the assassin on how to bypass international authorities, confirming that Kendra's death would trigger an immediate massive payout from a heavily guarded offshore life insurance policy he had secretly established in her name. The sheer calculated malice of the written words echoed through the courtroom, completely obliterating the defense's carefully constructed narrative and exposing Darian as a ruthless, cold-blooded predator who valued human life exclusively in terms of illicit financial gain. The devastating revelation of the premeditated murder plot completely annihilated any remaining fraction of Darian's legal defense, forcing the jury into absolute unified clarity. The deliberation process was incredibly swift, taking less than 2 hours for the foreperson to return to the heavily guarded courtroom with the final official decision. The judge demanded total silence as the formal verdict was read onto the permanent legal record. The jury delivered a swift, unanimous guilty verdict on every single federal charge, ranging from grand extortion and international money laundering to conspiracy to commit premeditated murder. The sheer magnitude of the inevitable sentence hit Darian with the physical force of a collapsing building. He completely lost all remaining muscular control, his legs buckling as he collapsed heavily into his wooden chair at the defense table. He gasped for air, his chest heaving in absolute panic as the inescapable reality of spending the rest of his natural life inside a maximum security federal penitentiary finally crushed his spirit. 2 armed federal bailiffs immediately stepped forward, grabbing Darian by the shoulders and forcefully hauling him to his feet. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs locking tightly around his wrists echoed through the silent chamber, marking the absolute end of his criminal reign. I did not stay to watch the federal agents drag my former son-in-law out through the side doors. I turned away from the defense table and looked directly at Kendra, who was weeping quietly in the front row of the gallery. I watched the profound, exhausting relief wash over her pale features and realized the hardest phase of our journey lay entirely ahead. The grueling legal battle was definitively over, but the monumental work required to heal my daughter's broken spirit had only just begun. The autumn air was crisp and unforgiving as Kendra and I stood side by side on the cracked concrete sidewalk of the suburban neighborhood. We stared quietly at the impeccably manicured front lawn of the property that had once served as the primary battleground for our very survival. A heavy wooden sign bearing the word "Sold" in bold, uncompromising crimson letters was driven deep into the freshly laid turf. The sprawling structure behind it had been entirely restored to its original pristine condition, stripped of every lingering shadow Darian had cast over its walls, effectively erasing the physical manifestation of his greed. The oppressive atmosphere of manipulation, chemical subjugation, and suffocating isolation that had thoroughly poisoned the residents was permanently eradicated from our reality. Standing there in the cool morning breeze, I watched the profound physical transformation in my daughter with immense paternal pride. The heavy, medicated lethargy that had clouded her bright eyes for 6 agonizing months was completely gone. She stood tall, her posture radiating a fierce, reclaimed dignity that no international syndicate or abusive husband could ever extinguish. Selling the house was the final, undeniable necessity to permanently sever our ties to the nightmare Darian had meticulously constructed. It was not merely a lucrative real estate transaction designed to liquidate physical assets. It was an absolute, legally binding reclamation of our family's sovereign independence. I placed a steady, reassuring hand on Kendra's shoulder, grounding her firmly in the present reality. The terrifying chapter of physical danger, late-night ambushes, and suffocating federal courtrooms was definitively closed. The violent chaos that had relentlessly battered our daily lives had finally burned itself out, replaced by a profound, hard-won tranquility that we had earned through sheer resilience. We had survived the grueling tactical storm, entirely dismantled the criminal infrastructure that sought to consume us, and successfully reestablished the fundamental order of our world. I turned away from the property and handed Kendra a thick, leather-bound portfolio containing the finalized financial manifests from the sale. I explicitly broke down the exact distribution of the liquidated assets, ensuring she understood the permanent foundation we were establishing. I informed her that the overwhelming majority of the massive capital generated from the suburban estate had already been electronically routed to a heavily vetted national charitable organization. The capital was specifically designated to protect and legally arm vulnerable victims of domestic financial abuse, providing a bulletproof safety net for families currently trapped in the exact same predatory cycle Darian had weaponized against us. Kendra traced her fingers across the black ink of the bank transfer receipts, tears of genuine gratitude pooling in her eyes as she grasped the sheer scale of the philanthropic maneuver. I then carefully withdrew the final legal document from the back of the portfolio and placed it directly into her trembling hands. It was a fully executed commercial real estate deed entirely in her name, completely devoid of any co-signers, hidden clauses, or secondary beneficiaries. I had utilized the remaining percentage of the house funds to purchase a beautiful sunlit retail storefront located in the heart of the city's thriving artisan district. I looked directly into her eyes and told her that this property would serve as the physical foundation for her own independent flower shop. Darian had systematically destroyed her confidence and isolated her from her passions, utilizing money as an invisible chain to enforce her absolute submission. This commercial deed was the ultimate countermeasure. It guaranteed her total, unbreakable financial sovereignty, ensuring she would never again be forced to rely on anyone else for her survival, her security, or her profound personal happiness. The ultimate undeniable payoff for our months of tactical warfare arrived strictly through formal judicial channels later that same afternoon. Mitchell forwarded the finalized sentencing report from the federal courthouse, bringing a definitive, utterly uncompromising end to the sweeping criminal conspiracy. Darian had officially received a devastating 20-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary, completely stripped of any possibility for early parole or administrative leniency. The brutal, unforgiving weight of the federal justice system had permanently crushed his arrogant ambition, locking him inside a concrete cell where his manipulative charms and fabricated narratives were absolutely worthless. With the mob syndicate entirely dismantled and his freedom permanently eradicated, Darian was reduced to a mere statistic within the penal system. I watched Kendra process the finality of his incarceration, her shoulders dropping as the last invisible remnants of his control dissolved into the autumn air. I reached into my jacket pocket and produced a small, crisp, white envelope, presenting it to her with a warm, genuine smile. She carefully unsealed the paper, sliding out 2 pristine first-class international airline tickets boarding for Rome. I explained that the upcoming father-daughter vacation to Italy was entirely funded by the remaining residual capital from the sale of the very house Darian had violently attempted to steal. The predator had meticulously planned to use that exact same European destination as a staging ground for a catastrophic, highly lucrative murder plot against her. Instead, we were going to utilize his stolen leverage to reclaim the beauty of the Mediterranean coast strictly on our own terms. We were going to celebrate our hard-won survival, transforming the exact geographic location of his darkest, most violent ambition into a permanent symbol of our total, indisputable victory over his calculated evil. Later that evening, the quiet comfort of my downtown apartment provided the perfect environment for the final necessary act of closure. The heavy stone fireplace crackled with a warm, inviting intensity, casting long, dancing shadows across the polished hardwood floor. I stood silently before the roaring hearth, holding a single crumpled piece of standard printer paper in my right hand. It was a physical transcript of the original arrogant text message Darian had sent me nearly a year ago, aggressively demanding a strict family-only vacation, while silently engineering the ruthless destruction of our lives. I stared at the dark ink forming his manipulative, deceptive words, feeling absolutely zero anger or residual bitterness. The man who had typed that message was permanently buried beneath the crushing weight of the federal penal system, entirely neutralized and entirely forgotten. I smiled softly, a genuine expression of absolute peace, and casually tossed the crumpled paper directly into the glowing orange center of the fire. The dry cellulose ignited instantaneously, curling inward as the bright flames consumed the toxic lies, rapidly reducing the arrogant threat to a pile of gray, weightless ashes drifting up the dark chimney. The physical manifestation of Darian's deception was permanently eradicated from my sanctuary. Kendra emerged from the adjacent hallway carrying her packed leather travel bag and wearing a bright, unburdened smile that illuminated the entire room. I stepped away from the warmth of the fading fire, securely wrapping my arm around my daughter's shoulders. We walked together toward the heavy oak door of the apartment, stepping confidently out into the cool, welcoming night air, ready to embark on a beautiful, unimpeded future that belonged entirely to us. True power does not reside in loud declarations, visible wealth, or arrogant displays of dominance. Real strength is cultivated in silence, forged through unwavering patience, and executed with calculated precision. This story teaches us that toxic individuals will always underestimate the quiet resilience of those they attempt to control. By maintaining your composure systematically, gathering undeniable truth, and striking only when the moment is perfectly aligned, you can permanently dismantle any web of manipulation. Reclaim your independence, protect your peace, and never allow fear to dictate your future. If this powerful story resonated with you, please subscribe and comment today.